They said civilization began in the mud from dust and hunger from frightened tribes huddled around fires. Yet the first cities appear not as fragile experiments, but as masterpieces, perfectly planned streets, laws older than memory, temples aligned to stars no one should have known. In less than a heartbeat of time, humankind went from stone tools to astronomy, from silence to symphonies carved in clay. Who taught us the rules of kingship, of faith, of order, if we truly rose from nothing? Then why does the dawn of history look more like a reboot than a beginning? And so you pause somewhere between awe and unease. Because every empire, every written word, every law you know, began with that impossible leap. Tonight you'll walk back to the threshold where the dust first became divine. The question is simple: did we build civilization or merely inherit it? The wind moves across a plain of broken stone. You stand where the first walls once rose, where order first conquered chaos. Civilization, a word too perfect for its own origin story. The textbooks say it began with farmers, merchants, and kings, but the evidence whispers something stranger. Cities appear, complete languages, already fluent gods, already enthroned. It's as though someone handed us the blueprint, then vanished. Maybe we weren't the first to rise, just the first to forget. And as the sands shift, the ruins seem to breathe again, daring us to remember. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. You begin in silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the heavy, resonant quiet that hangs in places older than time. Archaeologists call them pre-dynastic layers, the faint echoes beneath the ruins of the first known empires. They dig past the bricks of Sumer, past the sand of Egypt, and find something older: foundations that don't belong, stones placed before history even began writing its own name. It's here the mystery of civilization starts to fracture. Because beneath the earliest known cities lie traces of something that shouldn't exist, a pattern of order older than chaos itself. Take Göbekli Tepe, that strange hill in southeastern Turkey, where circles of stone stand like petrified titans. It was built around 9600 BCE, long before pottery, before agriculture, before towns. By all logic, hunter-gatherers could not have done this. Yet they carved, aligned, and assembled massive pillars weighing tons each, etched with animals' stars, and what look eerily like symbols. The discovery forced scholars to rewrite the very timeline of civilization. It was supposed to be nomads before farmers, farmers before temples. But here the temple came first. As one archaeologist murmured, brushing sand from a lion's face carved in limestone, they built religion before they built roofs, and Göbekli Tepe isn't alone. Across the world, scattered like forgotten footprints, are ruins that defy neat classification. The underwater structures off Yonaguni in Japan, megalithic alignments at Nabta Playa in Egypt's desert, and the strange precision-cut stones of Pumapunku in Bolivia. The coordinates change, but the feeling doesn't. Everywhere, someone was building someone who understood geometry, astronomy, and alignment long before textbooks say such knowledge existed. Each site whispers the same unsettling refrain: we are not the beginning. Of course, mainstream archaeology resists this narrative. The idea of an advanced pre-civilization sits uneasily beside the clean, linear story of progress. Scholars counter that what we call precision might simply be the product of generations of practice. 1,000 skilled hands can imitate perfection without understanding it. They point to natural erosion patterns, to optical illusions of design. Maybe the alignments to the stars are coincidence, maybe the carvings are just the wishful gaze of modern minds looking backward. Yet the data refuses to stay quiet. Even with carbon dating, some foundations beneath Sumerian sites seem too old. The deeper you dig the stranger, it becomes a layered memory of human effort stacked like geological time. And here's the curious thing the myths knew. The Sumerians spoke of the antediluvian kings rulers, who reigned for thousands of years before the Great Flood. The Egyptians remembered Zep-Tepi the first time, when gods walked beside men. The Mayans had their own previous ages, each one destroyed and reborn. For centuries, historians dismissed these stories as poetic origin myths, yet each seems to hint at something eerily consistent, a golden age erased, followed by rebirth. It's almost as if memory itself survived the cataclysm and guided the next builders, whispering through the stones how to begin again. But belief and evidence rarely share the same vocabulary. To some, these ruins prove only the power of imagination. To others, they are smoking guns of forgotten mastery. Between those extremes lies the more haunting question, not whether a lost civilization existed, but how its memory endured. Knowledge doesn't simply vanish. It hides it, mutates it, becomes myth. Perhaps what rose in Sumer Egypt and the Indus was not spontaneous genius, but inherited pattern. A kind of cultural DNA passed down through survivors who remembered how to shape the world. And if that's true, then civilization's dawn wasn't a single sunrise. It was an afterglow, the flicker of something once bright dimmed, but not extinguished. You can almost feel it when standing before those ancient stones, the air charged with an intelligence that predates you. Maybe that's what we keep hearing in the silence, the heartbeat of a civilization that refuses to be forgotten, echoing beneath the weight of its own erasure. Water is memory. It carries the silt of ages, carving its way through deserts and dreams, leaving behind life where there should be none. Every civilization that mattered began with a river, not beside it because of it. The Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Indus. These were more than waterways. They were calendars, highways, and gods all at once. To control a river was to control destiny. And so the first kings rose not by sword or divine decree, but by the mastery of floods. You can almost imagine it, the moment a wandering band of farmers realized they could predict the water's return. The Nile's rhythm became a heartbeat, rising, flooding, retreating each season, sculpting not just the land, but the minds that lived upon it. In Egypt, the word Iteru, meaning river, was synonymous with order itself. The pharaoh didn't just command the people, he commanded the flood. The annual inundation was his proof of divinity, his signature upon the world. Without his blessing, the water would fail, the soil would crack, and the gods would turn their faces away. Across the deserts and mountains, the same story unfolded differently. Along the twin rivers of Mesopotamia, kings didn't bless the water, they feared it. The Tigris and Euphrates were unpredictable, their floods violent and irregular. Survival required not prayer, but calculation. Thus, in place of Egypt's serene theology, rose a bureaucracy. Temples became granaries, priests became accountants, and the earliest written records, those neat little wedge-shaped marks in clay, weren't hymns, but ledgers. Names of workers, counts of grain, lists of debts owed to gods who had long since become landlords. Civilization, it seems, was born from the anxiety of keeping score. And then there was the Indus Valley, that quiet giant between deserts and sea. There, cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa rose with astonishing precision, grid-like streets, underground drainage water reservoirs that predate the Roman aqueduct by millennia. Yet no palaces, no royal tombs, no proclamations of divine kings. The river shaped a different order, collective, anonymous, almost democratic in its anonymity. The people worshipped the flow, not the throne. It's as if they understood what the others forgot, that power drawn from nature can drown just as easily as it sustains. But the rivers had moods, and when they shifted, so did destiny. The Nile, once generous, faltered. The Indus changed course, its waters withdrawing like a departing god. The Tigris and Euphrates silted and raged, bearing fields in salt and despair. Each collapse became a lesson written in Mud King's rise, where the water flows and fall when it does not. Still, what binds these rivers together isn't their geography, but their mythology. Each tells the same story in different tongues of divine teachers arriving from the flood bearing knowledge. In Mesopotamia, there was Oannes, the fishman, who rose from the sea to teach writing and law. In Egypt, Osiris drifted in from foreign waters to bring agriculture and kingship. In the Indus, the god Varuna ruled over the cosmic ocean, his eye watching from the river's surface. These myths scattered yet symmetrical hint at something older, a memory of migration or survival. Perhaps when the great floods of prehistory receded, refugees of a vanished world followed the rivers inland, carrying fragments of lost wisdom. Civilization in that light was not invention, but inheritance. There's a strange comfort in that thought. The idea that humanity's progress is a kind of memory, not of individuals, but of landscapes. The rivers remember when we do not. Even their bends and deltas mark where temples once stood, where songs once echoed against stone. The Euphrates still hides the bones of Uruk's kings. The Nile still whispers the hymns of its dead. You can stand on their banks today, and if you listen long enough, you might hear the same question murmured by reeds and ripples alike who taught us to live like gods. Yet for all their divinity, the rivers were never loyal. They gave, they destroyed, they moved on. And in their shifting, they forced humanity to adapt, to centralize, organize, remember. Every flood demanded record-keeping. Every drought required authority. Thus, the river didn't just birth kings. It birthed administration. It birthed hierarchy. It birthed the illusion that power could control nature, when in truth it was always the other way around. Looking back, you start to see a pattern. Civilization's first heartbeat wasn't the hammer against stone or the pen upon clay. It was the pulse of water meeting land, a conversation between chaos and control that still defines us. Every empire since has tried to repeat that miracle, to draw order from the current, to turn flow into foundation. But even now we're only imitating what the rivers first taught. And as night falls over those ancient deltas, the stars reflecting like scattered embers upon the water's skin, you realize something simple. Almost humbling civilization didn't rise beside the rivers. It rose because of them. They are the first dynasties, patient, enduring, indifferent, still carving their histories long after ours have dried to dust. Imagine a world without lines. No walls dividing land from land, no ledgers balancing work and debt, no map telling you where the river ends and the kingdom begins. Just endless movement, herders chasing seasons, hunters chasing herds. Then somewhere between mud and memory, someone draws the first boundary. Maybe it's a ditch around a village. Maybe it's a mark on a tablet. Either way, that line changes everything. Order begins when someone decides where chaos stops. The first cities, Uruk, Eridu, and their quiet cousins in Egypt's floodplains, weren't accidents of population. They were acts of control. The invention of irrigation had forced communities to cooperate. But cooperation breeds conflict. Who owns the water? Who decides when to plant or how to store the grain? When life becomes predictable, so does power. And so the first architects of order were not kings or soldiers. They were organizers, temple priests, record keepers, and those strange, anonymous minds that learned how to stack stones in straight lines. Archaeologists love their clay tablets. To the untrained eye, they look like cracked biscuits. But inside those grooves is humanity's first bureaucracy. In the ruins of Uruk around 3300 BCE, someone recorded the delivery of barley rations to temple workers. It wasn't a myth or a poem. It was accounting. The first written symbols before literature, before law, were little drawings of grain goats and jugs of beer. A civilization's earliest dream was not immortality, but inventory. There's something darkly funny about that, isn't there? The dawn of human order brought to you by spreadsheets on clay. Yet behind that mundanity was genius. To manage water and food, you need time. To measure time, you need observation. The priest astronomers of Sumer didn't just count stars for fun, they were synchronizing labor to the heavens. Each phase of the moon dictated when canals were dug or when taxes were due. Cosmic rhythm became civic regulation. Somewhere in that divine bureaucracy, the idea of kingship took root. The gods had their own celestial order. Surely their human servants deserved one too. Meanwhile, across the desert, the Egyptians were designing something subtler. Their early cities were less about commerce, more about ritual geometry. Streets and temples aligned to solstices, to the rising of Sirius, the herald of the Nile's flood. It was urban planning as theology. To live within those walls was to inhabit a cosmic diagram. You didn't just wake, eat, and work. You participated in the renewal of the world. The king was not the ruler, but the axis, the still point around which the great mechanism turned. Compare that to the Indus Valley, and the contrast is eerie. No grand palaces, no ostentatious temples, yet perfect order everywhere. Streets laid out with mathematical precision, standardized bricks used across hundreds of miles. Drains, sewers, reservoirs, all engineered with obsessive care. It's as if an invisible architect had drawn one master plan and then vanished. To this day, no royal names have been found, no statues of god-kings proclaiming victory. Just evidence of an astonishingly organized collective one that valued harmony over hierarchy. A civilization that somehow achieved order without a face. This raises a quiet but revolutionary question. What if the first rulers weren't people at all, but systems? The calendar, the irrigation schedule, the temple archive, each demanded obedience long before any crown did. When you control time, food, and belief, you don't need an army. You only need consistency. The first architects of order didn't conquer others. They conquered uncertainty. And yet the price of certainty is always fear. The moment you define a boundary, you create the possibility of trespass. The first walls that protected also imprisoned. The first records that preserved also judged. Bureaucracy may have saved humanity from chaos, but it also invented inequality. A missing ration mark could mean starvation. A misplaced seal could erase a life. Civilization, it turns out, was both an invention and a trap. Still, there's beauty in the madness. Imagine the hum of a city like Uruk at dusk, scribes pressing reeds into clay as the last light fades, priests counting offerings beneath flickering oil lamps, builders measuring stone with cords, stretched taut under the stars. None of them knew they were inventing permanence. To them, it was survival, the rhythm of doing what needed to be done. To us, it looks like genius. And somewhere in that hum, a subtle arrogance began to grow, the belief that humans could replicate divine order. When the irrigation canals mirrored constellations, when the city grid echoed the paths of the planets, the builders must have felt it, the thrill of imitation. The notion that to build in straight lines was to think like the gods. It's a sentiment that still echoes today, hidden beneath every blueprint and digital grid. The ancient world didn't just construct cities, it constructed logic itself. You can almost hear those first planners laughing across time. We brought order, they'd say. We tamed the wild. But the truth is softer, almost melancholic. The wild never went away. It simply learned to live beneath the pavement, waiting. Every city since then, every empire, every dynasty has been a mirror of that first act of control. The shape of our civilizations, the laws we write, the way we schedule our days, all born from a few hands pressing marks into wet clay under a fading sun. And as you think about that, the next truth begins to take shape. The same hands that drew the first lines also learned how to erase them. It begins with silence, not the peaceful kind, but the heavy quiet that hangs before a storm of meaning. Somewhere in ancient Sumer, a hand dips a reed into wet clay. The air smells of river mud and smoke. The hand hesitates, then presses one wedge, then another, a cluster of symbols that look like nothing, and yet everything. That moment 5,000 years ago is the first recorded attempt by humanity to trap thought in matter, to make memory physical. The clay spoke and history began to listen. Before writing, words vanished with the wind. The old storytellers could sing their lineages, their gods, their floods, but once they stopped, the tale dissolved. Writing changed that. It turned speech into artifact, story into architecture. The first tablets weren't poetry. They were receipts. Grain counted, workers paid, beer distributed. The earliest accountants were unknowingly the first historians. Each wedge pressed into clay said, I was here. I kept track. I mattered. It's strange how bureaucracy keeps saving civilization. The Sumerians invented cuneiform around 3200 BCE, lines, triangles, and hooks pressed into clay with mathematical precision. But soon those cold records grew warm. A word for barley became a metaphor for abundance. A symbol for king began to imply divine. By the time scribes mastered the script, they were already using it to shape reality itself. The oldest surviving literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, was born from that same clay. Think about that irony, a story about a king seeking immortality, written in a medium that outlasted empires. The clay tablets survived where palaces fell. Every mark on them is a breath from the dead. Some were so well fired that even the fires of conquest couldn't destroy them. To read them now is to eavesdrop on eternity. But writing wasn't invented once. Across the world, it erupted like lightning, cuneiform in Mesopotamia, hieroglyphs in Egypt, oracle bones in China, glyphs in the Olmec world. Scholars argue whether these scripts arose independently or spread through unseen threads of influence. Either way, the odds of coincidence feel suspiciously low. Four corners of the ancient world, all deciding almost simultaneously that thought should be made solid. That knowledge should outlive its speaker. It's as though an unseen whisper moved across continents. Write it down. And the question that lingers, the one that archaeologists never quite say aloud, is this: how did they learn to encode sound into shape? Language is ephemeral. Symbols are abstract. The leap from one to the other isn't small, it's a cliff. One theory says early tokens, little clay counters used for trade, evolved into pictographs. Another suggests that the shapes came from celestial observation, an imitation of the stars. But there's a deeper mystery beneath both ideas, why the urge to record at all. You might think it was practical, that the priests and merchants simply needed receipts. Yet buried tablets show evidence of something else: ritual. Many early inscriptions were deliberately buried in foundations sealed under temples and ziggurats. Words hidden, not shared. Why record language only to hide it? Perhaps writing began as incantation, not communication. The first readers may not have been merchants. They may have been magicians. There's an obscure fragment from the city of Nippur, a broken hymn praising the goddess Nisaba, patroness of writing. It calls her the lady of the counting house and the keeper of divine tablets. To her, the stylus was sacred. The act of inscribing was an offering. Imagine a world where writing was prayer, each mark a conversation with the divine. Even today, when you scribble your thoughts, part of you is still whispering to the same goddess. And yet writing also birthed tyranny. When you can fix a word, you can enforce it. A spoken order fades, a written law endures. The first contracts chained the poor as surely as they protected the rich. Language became power, and literacy became a weapon. The scribes of old were the elite, part priests, part bureaucrats, part sorcerers. They shaped the world with symbols, and most of their subjects could not even read what ruled them. It's hard not to see echoes of that today, hidden beneath the fine print of every digital agreement you never read. One of the strangest tablets ever found in Mesopotamia isn't about trade or war. It's a school exercise. A young scribe, frustrated, scribbles a complaint about his teacher. "You have beaten me. You have insulted me. But I have written well. The clay remembers even rebellion." You can almost hear the boy's exasperated sigh from 4,000 years away. Writing made humanity immortal and immediately gave us something to complain about. From there, the script spread like wildfire. Egypt added beauty, carving their language into monuments and tombs. China found prophecy in bone and bronze. The Phoenicians stripped it down to essentials, inventing the alphabet, the skeleton of every language that followed. But the pattern never changed. Every society that learned to write began to build dynasties. You can't have civilization without record, and you can't have record without ritual. The stylus was mightier than the spear because it could rewrite time. And if you look closely at those first tablets, you'll notice something almost humanly funny. The oldest written word for freedom doesn't appear until long after the word for tax. Civilization, it seems, found its priorities early. But there's one last question the clay still refuses to answer. Did we invent writing, or did writing invent us after all? Once you can store thought outside the mind begins to change. Memory weakens, abstraction grows, and history itself becomes architecture built, edited, and curated. Humanity stopped merely living time. It began to construct it. The clay that spoke never went silent. It became parchment, paper, silicon. Your words, my voice, the data pulsing through the wires tonight, all descendants of that first tablet pressed by trembling hands beside a river. Civilization didn't just rise from dust. It rose from dust that learned how to speak. Civilization, once written, began to rise. The tablets of Sumer did not stay in dusty storerooms, they became blueprints. Each wedge-shaped mark wasn't just a word, it was a brick. The first true cities, Uruk-Ur-Eridu Lagash, grew where scribes sat. Their streets weren't accidents of trade or riverbanks. They were born from planning, from thought translated into geometry. Humanity had learned not just to remember, but to organize. Walk through the ruins of Uruk today, and you walk through the ghost of order. Gridded streets, ziggurats that climb toward heaven in measured tiers, drainage canals precisely angled to flow without flooding. Someone designed this. Someone recorded it first. Before architects came accountants. The world's first metropolis was built on lists, grain inventories, temple offerings, worker rosters. From these dull, bureaucratic bones, a living city grew. But beneath that order burned something stranger: devotion. The same stylus that carved barley tallies also etched hymns to Inanna, goddess of love and war. Her temple, the Eanna precinct, dominated Uruk. Pilgrims came to leave offerings, scribes came to immortalize them, and so the world's first fusion of the sacred and the civic emerged, the temple state. Each god owned land servants and resources, all managed through the written word. Divine will became an administrative system. That system, of course, needed managers, priests, and scribes who could interpret both gods and ledgers. They became the first ruling class of record. Power shifted from the warrior to the literate. It's a shift we rarely think about, but every civilization since has repeated it. Empires rise not by conquest alone, but by documentation, by mastering the language of control. There's a reason why so many myths link creation to speech. In the beginning was the Word, the God named, and it was. Even in Sumer they said Enki spoke the divine decrees that gave shape to the world. To write was to imitate creation. Every clay tablet, every city plan, every law was a small echo of that original act. And from this echo came the next great leap, codified law. The most famous, of course, is Hammurabi's code, chiseled centuries later into basalt, tall as a man crowned by an image of the king receiving justice from the sun god Shamash. But Hammurabi didn't invent the idea, he inherited it. Sumerian rulers before him had already issued decrees, recorded rations, and judged disputes in writing. What Hammurabi did was monumentalize it. He turned language into stone, a statement that law itself was eternal. Yet within that perfection lies the paradox: writing froze justice as surely as it preserved it. To inscribe is to fix, and to fix is to deny change. A spoken sentence can adapt, a written law cannot. The clay and stone that birthed civilization also shackled it. Every rule preserved was a rule that might one day need to be broken. Still, those same stones carried humanity forward. With writing, the temple became archive, the priest became historian, the king became concept. Cities sprouted like mirrors along the rivers, the Tigris, the Nile, the Indus, the Yellow River, each a reflection of the same pattern record: organize, expand. You could almost call it a contagion of order. And yet amidst all this progress, something haunting remains. The ruins of those cities, their ziggurats half buried, their streets swallowed by sand, suggest that even perfect systems can fall. The tablets that once dictated life now lie cracked and unread, their wedge marks eroded by time. The very medium that promised immortality could not protect its makers from forgetting. Archaeologists often find strange anomalies: identical city layouts across thousands of miles, near identical measures of time and space, even similar myths of floods and divine kingship. Some see diffusion, others coincidence. But the pattern feels too precise to dismiss. It's as if the first cities were not independent experiments, but iterations of a single ancient blueprint, a design passed hand to hand, civilization to civilization, like a secret too useful to lose. And so the question grows sharper: did humanity invent civilization through writing? Or did something older plant the idea, leaving clay and fire as breadcrumbs? The answer for now lies buried in bricks and shards, in the burnt remains of a world that once believed it could make order eternal. The first rulers to step from the clay tablets were not merely men. They were walking contradictions, mortal bodies clothed in divine language. The Sumerians called them Lugal, great man, but their lists read like myth. Alulim of Eridu, 8 kings before the flood, each reigning thousands of years. It sounds absurd, until you realize the Sumerians weren't trying to measure time. They were measuring memory. In a world still half drowned in legend, Kingship itself was a sacred substance handed down like fire. Picture the court of Uruk, when its king was said to have been two-thirds divine. Gilgamesh, builder of walls and seeker of immortality. His reign is half poetry, half archaeology. We have his city, his ramparts, his name carved in stone, and his story chiseled into 12 tablets that outlived every brick. The Epic of Gilgamesh is more than myth. It's an autobiography written by civilization itself, whispering that even kings fear the dark. Behind that story was a quiet revolution. When the Sumerians began to record their rulers in sequence city by city, reign by reign, they were inventing something new: history as authority. A dynasty became legitimate not because of blood alone, but because it was written. Power and narrative fused. The king's scribes shaped both taxes and eternity, and yet the tablets hide a deeper strangeness. The earliest lines of the king list declare kingship descended from heaven. That phrase is repeated like ritual, as if kings were lightning striking earth. Some scholars shrug it off as metaphor. Others notice how sudden, how synchronized the appearance of kingship was across Mesopotamia. Multiple cities, same institutions, same myths. Coincidence or coordination? The evidence in ruins suggests something deliberate. Temples turned into palaces. Priests became administrators. Divine statues received tribute through royal proxies. The God King was not just ruler, but interface, a human bridge for cosmic order. To disobey him was to disrupt the universe. A convenient theology, perhaps, but also a fragile one. Because when a God King bled, people began to ask questions the tablets couldn't answer. Among those fragments lies an odd tablet from Kish. It records a reign so short, it barely counts a man named Kubaba, described as a tavern keeper turned monarch. She was later worshipped as a goddess, Cybele, the mother of kings. Her story challenges the whole masculine mythology of divine descent. How could a common woman inherit heaven's mandate? The text doesn't say. It only smiles as if daring us to fill the gap. These gaps are what keep historians awake. Were the long-reign kings mere mythic inflation, or memories of a pre-Sumerian order when rulers really did span centuries, not by lifespan, but by lineage acting under one name? Some propose that the exaggerated numbers encode lunar or ceremonial cycles, each year marking a festival rather than a revolution of the sun. Others wonder if the Sumerians were preserving echoes of forgotten ages, civilizations drowned before memory began. Whichever answer you prefer, the obsession with divine rule became contagious. Egypt would soon call its kings pharaohs, the living Horus. Akkad would craft an empire under Sargon, a man who claimed the same celestial blessing that had once descended from heaven. The template spread like mythic pollen, and with it the notion that humanity could embody the gods it once feared. And in a faint callback to our earlier trail of clay and fire, notice how every god king surrounded himself with scribes. Writing remained the secret machinery of holiness. Tablets multiplied, recording offerings, battles, omens. The voice of the divine was now bureaucratic, its miracles measured in barley rations and labor quotas. Power had found its paperwork. Still beneath the dust, one question lingers: if kingship truly descended, where did it descend from? Was it merely a poetic phrase for human ambition, or the memory of some teacher race now vanished? The Sumerians left no footnotes, only a pattern that would repeat for 5,000 years. A ruler half human, half myth, ruling cities that believed obedience kept the stars from falling. Every crown since has borrowed that illusion. And maybe that's the true inheritance of the god kings, not their blood, not their temples, but the idea that order itself requires something a little superhuman. Civilization began not in temples or thrones, but in the clatter of metal and the smell of burnt earth. When the first smelters of Mesopotamia and Anatolia discovered how to coax copper from stone, they unknowingly rewired the human story. What had once been survival, hunting, planting, enduring became transformation. Ore became weapon, clay became seal, grain became tax, and man became king. Power like bronze was something to be forged. You can almost hear it, the rhythmic strike of hammers outside the city walls, smoke curling upward, mixing with the incense of temple offerings. The Sumerians spoke of the god Enki as the patron of crafts, the one who gave humankind the arts of civilization. It's a comforting myth, the idea that divine wisdom fell from the heavens, but the archaeological record tells another quieter truth. Civilization was chemistry. It was the slow, patient merging of resources, rituals, and rules, until power itself became a material you could shape. The earliest dynasties learned quickly that control wasn't maintained through armies alone. It required mastery over matter and belief. The king who controlled metal controlled war. The priest who controlled ritual controlled heaven. The merchant who controlled trade controlled everyone in between. Somewhere among the ledgers and sacrifices, these threads braided into a single strand, the first elite. They weren't just rulers, they were alchemists of human desire. In the ruins of Ur and Lagash, we find tablets that don't list kings or laws, but inventories. Copper ingots, lapis lazuli, tin from the far mountains of Elam. How did such distant materials end up here in cities that had no wheels when they were founded? The answer lies in trade routes so ancient they predate history itself, arteries that carried not just goods, but ideas. Metallurgy was never local. Every crucible whispered of contact. Every blade was a map. And yet there's something almost mystical about how these networks functioned. The same societies that calculated rations by barley weight also believed each transaction pleased the gods. Commerce was prayer with receipts. When the Mesopotamian merchants sent caravans east, they invoked divine protection as much as profit. Every shipment of tin and copper that returned was celebrated like a miracle, the raw ingredients of eternity. But wealth alone does not make a dynasty. It must be turned into spectacle. Imagine a temple feast under flickering lamplight. The priests pour molten metal into divine molds, fashioning idols with faces of silver and gold. The king watches as artisans polish the god's new body until it gleams like sunrise. It's not just craftsmanship, it's propaganda. Metal was proof that the divine and human could merge. A mortal could commission eternity. There's an obscure tablet from Mari that describes an offering of bronze lions guarding a temple gate. They weren't weapons nor decoration, they were warnings. The lions embodied the king's power, made tangible, unyielding, eternal. To pass between them was to accept the order of the world. This psychological alchemy, turning fear into faith, faith into obedience, became the real secret of kingship. And of course, there was blood. Every workshop that hummed with progress also fed on exploitation. Slaves dug ore from the mountains. Farmers paid tribute to fuel armies. The same fire that birthed civilization consumed countless lives. Historians call this resource centralization. The ancients called it destiny. What makes this story stranger is how synchronized it was. Around the same time that Sumer was hammering bronze, Egypt's desert workshops glowed with the same heat. In the Indus Valley, similar metallurgical skill appeared, different gods, same technique. Were these parallel discoveries or echoes of a single spark? Scholars debate it endlessly. Some propose shared trade links. Others suggest that human need simply led to the same solution everywhere. Yet a few fringe researchers whisper of a deeper connection, a lost pre-metal age whose smiths carried their knowledge into the cradle of each new civilization. It's not impossible. We've already seen how kingship writing and architecture seem to have emerged as if from a template. Why not metallurgy, maybe power itself? The idea of turning chaos into control spreads like fire does, feeding on whatever it touches. And when it burns too hot, it leaves ruins for the next generation to rebuild. Think back to the god-kings of Sumer. Their divinity rested on control of the sacred, the eternal. But here among the forges and traders, we find a humbler kind of immortality, the human will to refine. Each dynasty that rose from the dust owed its strength not just to divine sanction, but to those who melted mountains for them. If the gods gave kings their crowns, the smiths gave them the metal to make them real. You could say civilization's first philosophers weren't priests or poets, but metallurgists, the ones who looked at raw ore and saw potential. Their legacy still glints beneath every empire that followed, from the bronze blades of Akkad to the iron emblems of Rome. Power in the end is always alloyed. Every civilization sooner or later turns its gaze upward. After feeding its people and securing its borders, it begins to build for the sky. The first farmers stacked mud into walls. The first kings stacked belief into mountains. Across deserts, valleys, and floodplains, the same impulse appears again and again, the need to shape permanence from impermanence. Ziggurats, pyramids, stepped temples, and tombs, the earliest skyscrapers of faith. They were less about shelter and more about memory. Imagine approaching Ur's great ziggurat at dawn. The air tastes of salt from the receding floodplain. The structure rises layer upon layer, its edges still dark from night. Priests ascend its staircase slowly barefoot, carrying baskets of grain and incense to feed the god Nana at the summit. It's not merely a ritual, it's rehearsal for eternity. The act of building was itself an act of worship, proof that humanity could resist the erosion of time. But here's the mystery. Why did so many early civilizations, separated by geography and culture, converge on the same architectural obsession? The Egyptians built pyramids. The Maya built them too, half a world away. The Mesopotamians raised ziggurats, the Chinese piled earthen mounds for their emperors. Even the Andes hold step pyramids older than some dynasties. Were these parallel inventions or variations of an ancient design, a blueprint humanity somehow remembered? The historian's answer is cautious structure follows belief. When a society thinks the divine dwells above it, builds upward. But the archaeological answer is more unsettling. The earliest monumental alignments are too precise, too mathematically aware. The Great Pyramid's alignment to true north, the ziggurat's proportions tied to celestial cycles, all appear centuries before formal geometry. As though architecture itself carried encoded knowledge that no single generation could have invented. Maybe that's why the ancients called their builders divine architects. In Sumer, they were the NC priest engineers who served both temple and crown. In Egypt, Imhotep designed Djoser's step pyramid, later deified for his genius. These figures weren't merely engineers. They were translators between heaven and earth. Each cornerstone laid was a line of prayer. Each measurement a declaration that the cosmos could be tamed through symmetry. There's a quiet tablet from Lagash that describes a king who wept while dedicating a temple foundation. He said he feared the forgetting of stone. Even then, they knew buildings die. Sand buries them, floods erase them, dynasties crumble. Yet still they built, not for survival, but defiance. The ziggurat was a sermon carved in clay. We were here. We reached higher than dust. If the metallurgists of the previous age mastered transformation, The builders mastered time. Their work stitched generations together. The grandson who added a new tier to a ziggurat felt connected to his ancestors and his descendants, who would rebuild it again after every flood. The monument became a living organism breathing through centuries, and of course it was propaganda at scale. To stand before a pyramid was to feel small, and that was the point. These structures redefined obedience. The people who carried stones were building not just for gods, but for the illusion of eternity their rulers promised. A dynasty's legitimacy was measured by how high it could pile faith. But dig deeper, and you find a tension between devotion and ego. Some rulers built for their gods, others built for themselves. Khufu's Great Pyramid served both a tomb and a stairway to heaven. Its internal passages mimic the path of the sun through the sky, its orientation flawless. Scholars still argue over how such precision was achieved with stone tools and copper chisels. Some claim ramps and levers. Others suspect lost techniques, perhaps technologies forgotten when those civilizations fell. It's the kind of enigma that keeps conspiracy theorists busy and archaeologists politely exhausted. The true answer might be simpler and sadder. When belief is absolute, labor becomes limitless. People can move mountains when they think the mountain is watching. That faith in gods, in kings, in legacy was the invisible mortar binding every stone. Across time, echoes of this obsession resurface. The Persians build Persepolis, the Greeks raise the Parthenon, the Romans pour concrete to outlast eternity. Every empire, every dynasty eventually crafts its own message to posterity: remember us. And yet, as we've seen again and again, the sand has its own patience. Perhaps that's why the ancients placed foundation deposits, little clay boxes, filled with offerings and inscriptions deep beneath their temples. They knew the walls above would fall, but the earth below might keep their prayers safe. It's as though they whispered to us, through the soil, you will find us again. And we did. Every excavation, every brushstroke across ancient stone is a conversation with those builders. Their silence teaches us what power truly fears, not rebellion, not hunger, but forgetting. In the rhythm of these monuments, we can still hear civilization trying to speak its own name, loud enough to echo across millennia. The builders of eternity may have failed to halt time, but they succeeded in something grander. They made us remember to look up. It begins, as most turning points do, with fear. Not the sudden terror of an ambush, but the long, slow dread of scarcity. When harvests fail, when river levels drop, when neighbors eye the same pasture, that's when cooperation fractures. Before kings wore crowns, before cities raised walls, humans built alliances out of necessity. But alliances, once tested by blood, tend to harden into hierarchy. Picture the ancient plains of Mesopotamia under the glare of an endless sun. Two villages stare at one another across a narrow canal. Both depend on the same water, both claim the same god blessed it first. At first, disputes were solved by ritual oaths, feasts, gestures of goodwill. But rituals falter when the crops die. One side builds a dike to hoard the flow. The other retaliates with fire. Somewhere amid the smoke, a leader emerges, the strongest voice in the panic, the one who promises order through victory. That moment, when defense became dominance, marks the true birth of the state. Archaeologists trace it through layers of ash and arrowheads. Sites like Hamukar in Syria show evidence of large-scale urban warfare as early as 3500 BCE, smashed walls, charred grain silos, and thousands of slingstones littering the streets. The attackers weren't bandits. They were organized. Someone planned supply lines, someone issued commands, and someone convinced hundreds to risk death for territory. The irony, of course, is that once the battle is over, you can't return to village life. War demands infrastructure, storage, logistics, metallurgy, and those structures become permanent. You can't unbuild bureaucracy any more than you can unlearn fear. So victory demands administration, and administration demands obedience. Thus, the warrior becomes a ruler, and the ruler becomes sacred. Power crystallizes around the sword that once defended the fields. The Sumerians had a word for this transformation, lugal, meaning big man. He was both chief and God's chosen protector. At first, the title was temporary, a wartime appointment, but peace never lasted long, and the big man found reasons to stay in charge. Every generation afterward would build on his precedent. It's a familiar pattern, emergency powers that never end. You could say civilization owes more to paranoia than progress. Look closely, and you'll see the same evolution repeating elsewhere. In Egypt, the unification of Upper and Lower Nile around 3100 BCE came after centuries of territorial skirmish. The Narmer palette, that ceremonial slab of carved stone, isn't just art, it's propaganda. On one side, Narmer wears the crown of the south, on the other, the crown of the north. 2 crowns, 1 ruler. The carving shows decapitated foes, lined up neatly, their heads placed between their legs, like punctuation marks in divine grammar. Violence in its polished form became theology. There's a chilling symmetry in how quickly religion adapts to war. The gods who once blessed fertility now bless conquest. In Sumer, Inanna shifts from patroness of love to goddess of battle. In Egypt, Horus, the skyhawk, becomes the living symbol of kingship. In the Indus, where we lack written myths, we still find fortifications rising in perfect sequence, as though divine geometry had been retooled for defense. One might expect war to destroy culture, but paradoxically, it refines it. Once cities need soldiers, they need taxes. Once they need taxes, they need records, scribes, overseers. Out of fear grows administration. Out of administration grows civilization. You can almost hear the bureaucrats sighing centuries later, all this because someone built a dam in the wrong place. Still, it wasn't all conquest. War forged something intangible: identity. Before armies marched, people were bound only by kinship or geography. After war, they shared loyalty to a banner, a myth, a name. A people became a nation not when they planted crops, but when they buried their dead under the same flag. Yet beneath the triumphal inscriptions, another story lingers: the invisible cost. Excavations at Lagash and Kish reveal mass graves where no one built monuments. The forgotten soldiers who built civilization's spine were often nameless. Their bones lie tangled under palace foundations, literally supporting the structures their kings claimed as divine. And what of those kings? They too became prisoners of the system they forged. To keep power, they had to wage endless campaigns. A single lost battle could erase a dynasty's legitimacy. The state born from war could never stop feeding on it. Historians sometimes call this the militarization trap. Once the machinery of conflict exists, it demands maintenance. Empires learned this lesson repeatedly, from Akkad to Rome to modern borders drawn in ink and arrogance. There's a small inscription from the Akkadian ruler Naram Sin that captures the curse perfectly. It reads, "I fought the mountain who would not submit, and now I am king of the 4 corners." But shortly after his reign, the empire collapsed. The mountains, as it turns out, do not stay conquered. You might recall from our last section the builders who sought eternity through stone. War built a different kind of monument, one made of systems, hierarchies, and myths. You can still see its shadow in every flag, every border, every oath sworn to an anthem. It's the architecture of obedience, carved not in limestone but in fear. So perhaps it's not entirely fair to say the state was invented by kings. Maybe it was born in the trembling hands of the farmers who picked up weapons to defend their fields and never put them down. Power once seized must be justified. A sword can win a throne, but only a story can keep it. And no story proved more enduring or more deceptive than the illusion of divine blood. The moment the first ruler claimed descent from the gods, history began its longest magic trick. Generations would kneel to names believing that blue veins hid celestial light. Imagine standing in a Sumerian courtyard around 2500 BCE. A priest announces that the king is not merely mortal. He is the vessel of Dingir divine essence. The crowd bows partly out of fear, partly out of awe. 1,000 years later, on another continent, Egyptian farmers gaze up at a golden mask and whisper that the pharaoh's bloodline flows directly from the sun. Centuries after that, Chinese emperors claim the mandate of heaven, while Incan rulers trace lineage to Inti, the solar father. Everywhere the story changes its costume but never its purpose. At its core, the divine blood myth solves an administrative problem: succession. Mortality complicates governance. But if a ruler's authority comes from heaven, then his heirs inherit it by default. No election, no rebellion, no discussion. You can't vote out a god. The genealogical fiction became the backbone of political continuity. Dynasties turned into family cults. Family trees became sacred scripture. And yet beneath that shimmering myth, the bloodline was fragile, both literally and symbolically. Royal inbreeding, meant to preserve divine purity, often led to frailty and madness. The pharaoh Akhenaten's elongated skull, the Habsburg jaw, centuries later, these were physical testimonies to the dangers of believing power could be kept in the veins. Even in the earliest Sumerian records, the long-reign kings who supposedly ruled for thousands of years blur into fantasy, as though the scribes themselves couldn't quite tell where divinity ended and delusion began. There's an obscure tablet from Lagash that complicates the illusion further. It records a local rebellion led by a commoner who claimed to be chosen by the gods in place of a corrupt ruler. The rebellion failed, but the story spread. Power, it seemed, could also be adopted, borrowed from divine favor, rather than inherited from divine blood. This tension between birthright and merit would echo through every dynasty thereafter. Scholars still debate where this idea truly began. Some argue that the divine blood myth emerged not from theology but from biology, the simple observation that children resemble their parents. In a pre-scientific world, that resemblance felt mystical. If a ruler was extraordinary, then surely his offspring shared some invisible spark. But there's another darker interpretation, that rulers invented the idea precisely to erase the human origins of power. Claim divine descent, and no one asks where your father's army came from. By the time of Hammurabi, the language of kingship had evolved into a cosmic script. Hammurabi's famous law code opens with the declaration that he was called by Anusu and Enlil to bring justice to the land. Not chosen by the people, not approved by elders. Called. The phrase transforms personal ambition into destiny. You can question a man. You can't question the gods who allegedly sent him. But of course, divine right carries divine risk. If victory proves legitimacy, then defeat proves abandonment. The same myths that sanctify rule can damn it. In Egypt's first intermediate period after the collapse of the Old Kingdom, priests quietly rewrote hymns to explain why their once godlike pharaohs had failed. The sun god Ra, they said, had turned his face away. The dynasty's bloodline was not impure. It was merely inconvenient to heaven. A celestial shrug. This fragile theater of divinity required constant maintenance. Every coronation, every ritual renewal of kingship was a rehearsal of divine favor. In Sumer, the sacred marriage ceremony joined king and priestess in a symbolic union to reseed heaven's power on earth. In Egypt, pharaohs reenacted the daily rebirth of the sun, proving their vitality before both gods and men. Even in China, the emperor's annual plowing of the sacred field reaffirmed the cosmic contract between ruler and soil. Each act whispered the same message: I am not just born of heaven. Heaven still approves of me. And yet, even with all this ceremony, whispers persisted. Court scribes, rival princes, neighboring city-states all questioned the myth in quiet moments. They watched rulers age, falter, bleed. A god who limps is hard to worship. Over time, dynasties began to graft legitimacy through marriage, merging competing bloodlines into one sprawling celestial family tree. Divine essence became bureaucratized. By the time of the Akkadians, royal propaganda no longer emphasized holiness, but inheritance. The gods faded into the background. Pedigree became the new divinity. It's strange to realize that this illusion, born millennia ago, still haunts the modern imagination. We may not call our leaders divine anymore, but we still chase surnames, legacies, and dynasties of influence. Somewhere deep down, the old spell lingers, the belief that greatness can be passed through the bloodstream like a secret inheritance. And perhaps that's why, even as you trace ancient inscriptions or peer at portraits in museums, you feel a flicker of recognition. The faces change, the titles evolve, but the story remains the same: a civilization convincing itself that power must be born, not earned. The illusion of divine blood was the softest lie and the most necessary. Without it, the walls of empire would crumble under the weight of uncertainty. With it, generations marched willingly beneath banners of myth, serving families who claimed to be more than human. The question that endures is whether they ever believed it themselves. Power myth and monument have always shared the same heartbeat. When a civilization wished to prove that its ruler was divine, it didn't write essays, it carved mountains. Across the ancient world, stone became theology in physical form, the architecture of belief. The Sumerians had already etched their divine bloodlines in clay, but their successors raised them toward the heavens themselves. Each block of stone was a sentence in an unspoken scripture, one that proclaimed, "The gods walk among us, and this is where they live." The earliest examples come from Mesopotamia's ziggurats, tiered ascending temples designed not for public worship, but for cosmic alignment. The most famous, the ziggurat of Ur, stood as a stairway between earth and sky. Its summit shrine, dedicated to Nana, the moon god, was accessible only to priests and kings. The ordinary citizen never ascended it. They could only gaze upward, reinforcing the illusion of hierarchy. The ziggurat wasn't just a temple, it was a diagram of divine order. The king stood above the people, and the god stood above the king. Further west, the Egyptians perfected the idea of stone as immortality. The pyramid wasn't a tomb, it was an ascension machine. Every angle of the Great Pyramid of Khufu pointed toward eternity, the North Star, the imperishable one. To climb its slope in the imagination was to follow the pharaoh's soul as it rose from manhood to godhood. The hieroglyphic texts carved inside later pyramids confirmed this cosmic purpose. The king is a star, unfailing forever. The architecture itself performed the transition from dust to dynasty. Archaeologists often describe these monuments in technical terms: cutting angles, labor forces, quarry logistics. But those details, though impressive, miss the psychological core. Monumental stone construction was not only a demonstration of resources, it was a collective act of worshipful obedience. Tens of thousands of laborers worked for decades, not merely out of fear, but conviction. The stone itself was proof that their world made sense. The divine ruler's existence explained the structure of the cosmos, and in return, the cosmos justified the ruler's command. As centuries passed, the architectural language of divine kingship evolved, but never disappeared. The great temple complexes of Egypt, Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel, turned myth into geography. In each, the king's image marched alongside gods in endless procession, carved at the same scale, indistinguishable in posture. Even when the pharaoh's physical body crumbled, his image endured perpetually renewed through ritual. Every festival of Opet, every reenactment of the king's union with Amun, reinforced this illusion. In the minds of the people, their ruler was not merely chosen by the gods, he was one. And yet the deeper mystery lies not in how these monuments were built, but why they were built in such staggering scale. Take Angkor Wat, half a world away, and 2 millennia later. Its founder, King Suryavarman II, declared himself the earthly embodiment of Vishnu. The temple's layout mirrored the Hindu cosmos itself, central towers as Mount Meru, the axis of the universe. The moat surrounding it wasn't just defensive, it symbolized the cosmic ocean. The entire city was a three-dimensional map of heaven on earth. The message once again was unmistakable: to serve the king was to serve the divine order itself. From Egypt to Cambodia, from the Andes to the Pacific, this architectural theology reappears with eerie consistency. The Inca built Machu Picchu not only as a royal retreat, but as a celestial observatory aligned with solstices and sacred peaks. The gods, it seemed, demanded precision, and so did their kings. Even the colossal heads of the Olmec civilization, their faces frozen in eternal vigilance, suggest rulers who had stepped beyond humanity into something half-remembered, half-revered. But this stone language also hides a paradox. The more perfectly divine these monuments tried to appear, the more they revealed human insecurity. A god has no need to prove his eternity. Only a mortal does. Every block of limestone, every granite colossus was a silent admission of doubt. Kings built to outlast their own deaths, but in doing so they left behind evidence of their mortality. When we gaze upon the shattered pyramids, the half-buried temples, the worn statues whose faces have been erased by time, we are seeing the moment when myth collided with decay. There's a haunting tablet from the city of Ebla that captures this irony. It records a king's prayer: "May my name be written in stone, that it not be washed away when my bones turn to dust." His wish was granted, the stone remains, but his name is incomplete, the final symbols eroded beyond recognition. Immortality achieved, identity lost. These monuments also conceal technological mysteries. Modern engineers still debate how certain megalithic sites were constructed, how the 800-ton stones at Baalbek were moved, or how the precision-cut walls of Cusco interlock without mortar, impervious to earthquakes. While speculative theories abound, the essential truth may be simpler: divine kingship mobilized not only human labor, but human belief at a scale rarely seen since. People built the impossible because they believed they were building for eternity, and that belief was contagious. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, he didn't destroy its temples, he rebranded them. Declaring himself son of Amun, he inserted his name into the lineage of god-kings that stretched back 2,000 years. The same architectural grammar, the same stone vocabulary of divinity, now served a new master. Through empire after empire, the pattern repeated: rulers who built in stone sought to borrow time from the gods. Today, when we visit these ruins, we often marvel at their endurance. But endurance was never the goal, it was a side effect. The true goal was transformation. Stone turned a man into a myth, and a myth into memory. In this way, the architecture of divine kingship succeeded perfectly. The bodies of rulers have vanished, yet their presence remains palpable, carved into landscapes and psyches alike. The god-kings of stone may be gone, but their language persists in the skyscrapers, memorials, and capitals of our own age. We still build high to reach the heavens, still name towers after the powerful, still believe on some subconscious level that height equals holiness. In that sense, the oldest temples never fell. They simply changed materials. The question that shadows all this stone is not, how did they build it, but what did they fear? Each monument was a shield against oblivion, a declaration that dust could become dynasty. And for a moment, under the gaze of 1,000,000 tons of carved rock, perhaps it did. Patterns whisper through time. You see them in the symmetry of temples, half a world apart, in the uncanny geometry that links ziggurat to pyramid obelisk to stupa. Civilizations that never met somehow spoke the same architectural language. It's almost as if the blueprints for civilization were not invented but remembered. You begin in Mesopotamia, where the first planned cities emerged like thoughts made solid. The streets of Ur and Eridu formed perfect right angles, their walls aligned with celestial bodies. The builders weren't guessing, they were measuring the cosmos. To them, construction was a ritual of balance. Every brick had a place, every doorway a direction, every foundation a prayer. The temple wasn't built for the gods, it was built as one. Travel east, and you find echoes of the same design logic. The Indus Valley cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa reveal drainage systems and standardized bricks features, too rational, too uniform to belong to trial and error. They imply a code, a set of rules known, obeyed, and passed along across generations. Archaeologists call it urban planning. The ancients called it Ma'at Rita, or cosmic order. The names differ. The mathematics do not. Even Egypt's pyramids seem to obey that invisible script. The ratio of their base to height mirrors natural harmonies, the same proportions later revered by Greek architects and Renaissance artists. Some believe these were coincidences of engineering necessity, but others studying the same angles and alignments see deliberate echoes, an inheritance of sacred geometry that predates Egypt itself. Stone to stone, century to century, the pattern persists. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the stepped pyramids of Central America, the temples of Angkor, and the earth mounds of the Mississippians all share one strange feature, an upward slope, a stairway of ascension. Different gods, different tools, same idea. You build to reach the heavens. Yet what fascinates most scholars is how accurately these builders understood astronomical alignments. The Temple of Karnak in Egypt points to the rising sun at the solstice. So does Stonehenge thousands of miles away. The Maya built observatories that tracked Venus. The Babylonians recorded lunar cycles with mathematical precision. There's a unity here that feels larger than culture, almost as though architecture itself was humanity's first form of universal language. An obscure Babylonian tablet mentions the measurement of the heavens laid in clay, a poetic way to describe geometry perhaps, but also a metaphor. To measure the sky is to claim mastery over chaos. When ancient builders aligned temples with stars, they weren't decorating. They were anchoring their world to something eternal. The code of architecture was a way to mirror the order of the cosmos on Earth. And yet beneath this harmony lies contradiction. How did these cultures isolated by oceans and epochs converge upon such precision? Did knowledge travel along forgotten routes of trade? Did wandering architects carry their secrets from one empire to the next, disguised as merchants or priests? Or did each civilization simply look to the same sky and find the same answers? The Egyptian texts speak of the followers of Horus, divine builders, who raised the mounds before the flood. In Sumer, similar legends tell of the Abgalu half-gods who taught humans how to measure and construct. These tales might be mythological veneers for something real, a pre-dynastic group of master builders whose influence rippled outward. It's a tempting theory, though mainstream archaeology remains cautious. Still, the stone itself seems to argue. One of the strangest cases lies in the architecture of Cusco, Peru. The massive Inca walls there fit together so tightly that a blade cannot pass between them. No mortar, no written plans. Yet the pattern of interlocking polygonal stones follows geometric principles seen in ancient Asia. The same inclined angles, the same inward-sloping walls to resist earthquakes. Did the Incas rediscover the same mathematical truths, or inherit fragments of an older tradition? You can trace this geometry forward too. Greek temples borrowed Egyptian proportion. Roman builders refined it. The Parthenon, with its subtle curvature and harmonic ratios, echoes the same cosmic balance as the temples of Ur. When Renaissance thinkers rediscovered Euclid and Vitruvius, they claimed to be inventing perfect proportion, but in truth, they were resurrecting something far older. Even today, modern architecture still bows to that ancient code hidden in blueprints reborn in steel and glass. But if there was a universal architectural language, it wasn't just mathematics, it was meaning. Each structure embodied a worldview. The temple symbolized heaven meeting earth. The palace symbolized divine right manifest. The city itself was a cosmic map, its gates aligned with solstice light, its walls patterned after constellations. To walk through an ancient city was to walk through an encoded myth. Every shadow, every arch, every line of sight carried spiritual grammar. And maybe that's what the builder's code really was, not a secret formula for construction, but a philosophy, a way of turning belief into stone. To build was to remember. Each civilization consciously or not preserved fragments of the same memory that the world must be ordered, measured, and mirrored. That heaven and earth must speak the same geometry, or both collapse into chaos. Archaeologists sometimes find mistakes in ancient construction angles, slightly off orientations, imperfect. Yet in many cases, those errors align perfectly with later astronomical shifts. Could the builders have accounted for precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis? If so, they built for the future, ensuring that even as the heavens drifted, their temples would one day realign again. The code in that sense wasn't just sacred, it was prophetic. The further you trace it, the more it seems civilization itself is built upon memory encoded in matter. Ruins teach ruins. Every dynasty inherits not only stones, but ratios, layouts, silent grammar. When Babylon fell, its masons fled to Persia. When Thebes burned, its priests carried their scrolls to Alexandria. When Rome collapsed, its arches resurfaced in cathedrals. The stones never die. They migrate. And so the pattern continues, subtle and unstoppable, an ancient pulse running through time's architecture. From the ziggurats of Sumer to the towers of modern cities, we have never stopped building to mirror the cosmos. Perhaps without realizing it, we're still reciting the same silent prayer the first builders whispered, "Let the world be measured so it may endure." The stones understood something we've forgotten, that geometry was never just shape. It was faith translated. In the shadows of kings, a quieter power moved, one that rarely wore a crown, yet shaped the very bloodlines of empire. Every dynasty, for all its pomp and lineage, began not with the sword, but with the womb. The women of ancient courts, queens, priestesses, concubines, mothers, were the architects of legitimacy. Without them, the concept of dynasty itself could not exist. Yet history remembers them as whispers, The Sumerian lists that boast of kings ruling for centuries mention their mothers only in passing. Egyptian reliefs show queens behind the pharaoh smaller in scale but equal in poise. And in the palaces of Assyria, frescoes depict women cloaked, veiled, and watching. Behind those masks of modesty lay strategy, a world of alliances, betrayals, and inheritance more intricate than any war. Take Sumer's Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon the Great. History calls her the first-named author, a high priestess who wrote hymns to the goddess Inanna. But her true role was political. Through her devotion, Sargon fused religion and monarchy, transforming divine worship into dynastic propaganda. By writing herself into the voice of the goddess, Enheduanna didn't just praise the divine, she became its mouthpiece. Her words sanctified her father's rule and bound future kings to a celestial lineage. It was theology as statecraft authored by a woman. Centuries later, Egypt's Hatshepsut would master the same art. When her husband died, she claimed the throne, an unthinkable act. But instead of rebellion, she wrapped her rule in divinity. She commissioned statues of herself wearing the pharaoh's false beard, called herself the perfect god, and traced her conception to Amun, king of the gods. It was a performance of legitimacy so flawless that it worked. The priests bowed. The people obeyed. Even her male successors, who later tried to erase her name, could not undo the precedent she had set. That authority could be worn like a mask. Across cultures, this pattern repeats. The goddess and the queen merge and power transforms. In Minoan frescoes, women dominate the sacred rituals, snake priestesses, holding serpents aloft, commanding fear and awe. In early Mesopotamia, temple women called Nadatu held vast property rights, managing estates independent of male oversight. Their existence suggests that for a time power was not gendered, but shared a partnership later rewritten by patriarchal dynasties that feared the same autonomy they once depended on. It's tempting to see the ancient queen as mere consort and ornament beside the king, but archaeology keeps betraying that illusion. In the royal tombs of Ur, women were buried with wealth equal to their male counterparts, sometimes with harps and gold headdresses, their attendants slain beside them. These weren't passive figures. They were embodiments of the divine feminine vessels through which fertility, stability, and cosmic order flowed. The dynasty lived or died through them. And yet the mask mattered. The matriarch's influence had to appear invisible to remain absolute. A whisper in the king's chamber, a gesture during the ritual, a single arranged marriage, these were the levers that turned empires. In Egypt, Nefertiti's serene smile on the Amarna walls hides a far more complex truth. She was not merely Akhenaten's wife. She was his co-ruler, possibly his successor. Her image vanished after his death, only to resurface as a symbol of beauty. But beauty was always a disguise for control. There's an obscure Akkadian inscription describing a queen who holds the seal, but not the throne. Scholars believe it refers to Kubaba, the tavern keeper, who somehow became ruler of Kish, the only woman listed among Sumer's kings. How the records are silent. But her name reappears centuries later as a goddess in Anatolia, worshipped as Cybele, the mother of gods. A mortal woman turned myth. Power, it seems, wears many masks, and sometimes the mask becomes divine. Historians often debate whether early societies were once matriarchal, later supplanted by patriarchy. The evidence is murky, but the persistence of female deities from Inanna to Isis to Ishtar suggests that memory of female centrality never vanished. It simply changed costume. The goddess became the queen became the advisor became the ghost behind the throne. Even in later dynasties, Babylon, Persia, Rome, the pattern endures. Queens wielded silence as weapon and womb as diplomacy. A son born at the right moment could avert war. A daughter married to the right rival could end it. The true architecture of empire wasn't built from stone and conquest, but from calculated lineage. Dynasties were blood rituals in disguise. Think of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh. Her power wasn't merely seductive, it was mathematical. She descended from generations of Ptolemaic inbreeding, designed to keep bloodlines pure and control internal power. But purity came at a cost. Her dynasty decayed from within its gods, and blood equally exhausted. Cleopatra saw this and sought renewal not through Egyptian tradition, but Roman alliance. Her fall wasn't just political. It was the collapse of an entire genetic ideology. A light joke, if you'll allow it, maybe history didn't start with the great men at all. Maybe it was the women quietly proofreading the bloodlines. Kings wrote their names in stone. Queens wrote theirs in flesh. The question historians still wrestle with is whether these women consciously wielded such influence, or if they simply played the limited roles allowed to them so perfectly that they redefined the game. Perhaps it's both. The matriarch's brilliance lay in knowing that power doesn't always need to be seen to be absolute. And so every dynasty wears a mask, one crafted by its queens. Behind each golden crown stands an invisible hand shaping blood into legacy, turning mortality into myth. In the story of civilization, kings may have ruled the stage, but the script was written elsewhere, whispered behind veils, sealed with birth, and carried forward in silence. There comes a moment in every empire's life when the horizon burns. Crops fail. Armies vanish. Cities once humming with divine confidence fall silent beneath drifting ash. The late Bronze Age, that glittering era of kings' palaces and trade, ended not with a single war, but with a chain reaction that devoured nearly everything. Between 1200 and 1150 BCE, the known world collapsed. Mycenae, Hattusa, Ugarit, Troy gone. Egypt barely survived. Mesopotamia fractured. And for centuries afterward, people spoke of it the way survivors speak of fire in whispers, eyes still reflecting the glow. You stand now among those ruins. The ground crunches with the dust of cities burned 3,000 years ago. Archaeologists call this the Bronze Age collapse. But the label hides the trauma. These weren't minor kingdoms. These were civilizations that had stood for 1,000 years, with written law trade networks stretching across seas and archives of clay that recorded their every breath. Then within decades, they were gone. Theories compete for the cause. Climate change, earthquakes, famine, invasions by the mysterious sea peoples, maybe all of them colliding like dominoes. But what matters isn't just that the world ended, it's that it restarted. Out of the ash came a new kind of civilization, one that remembered the old dynasties only as myth. The collapse didn't destroy humanity's story, it reset it. Take Ugarit, a coastal city-state on the Syrian shore. In its final hours, scribes still wrote desperate letters. The enemy ships are here. Our cities are burning. Those tablets baked by fire survived where their world did not. They reveal a culture connected to Egypt, Crete, and the Hittite Empire. A Bronze Age web of diplomacy and trade so advanced, it rivaled modern globalization. Its failure then wasn't random. It was systemic. When one node fell, all others followed. Historians once imagined the Sea Peoples as barbarians, faceless invaders from beyond the horizon. But newer evidence suggests they weren't outsiders at all. They were refugees. When drought and famine shattered the eastern Mediterranean, people fled their dying homelands. The invaders and the invaded were often the same. Starving farmers became raiders, soldiers became pirates. Civilizations ate themselves alive not out of malice but desperation. A curious parallel emerges here, a callback to the floods and resets described in earlier myths. Just as ancient stories spoke of gods washing away corruption with water, the Bronze Age collapse became a kind of cultural purification by fire. Entire dynasties once deemed eternal vanished. Yet in their absence, new forms of governance emerged, city-states like Athens and Jerusalem, empires like Assyria reborn from ruin. The cycle of civilization, rise, decay, rebirth, turned again. There's a small but fascinating detail from Egypt's records. During the reign of Ramses III around 1175 BCE, inscriptions at Medinet Habu boast of victory over the Sea Peoples. But even in victory, Egypt was changed. The pharaoh's treasury emptied. Grain stores dwindled. Within a generation, tomb robbers, once unthinkable, were looting the Valley of the Kings. The divine order cracked. Yet from those cracks, the first stirrings of a more human world appeared. The gods grew quieter. History began to speak. Archaeologists have found layers of black ash over cities once resplendent with bronze and lapis. Under that ash, buried treasures remained: weapons, jewelry, clay tablets frozen mid-collapse. One particularly haunting discovery came from Hattusa, the Hittite capital. In its final days, someone locked the gates and sealed the archives. Thousands of tablets remain, some unfinished, their writers interrupted mid-sentence. It's as if the act of civilization itself paused. But here's where the story bends. From these ruins rose the foundations of the Iron Age, a technological leap that transformed warfare, agriculture, and statecraft. Iron tools replaced bronze, but the shift was more than metallurgical. It was symbolic. The soft sheen of bronze gave way to the hard endurance of iron, a new world forged in the furnace of collapse. Civilization learned that endurance, not glory, was the truer measure of power. Modern scholars like to debate whether this collapse was inevitable. Were the old empires simply too complex, too interdependent to survive? Or did some unseen cultural fatigue play its part, an exhaustion of belief, of divine legitimacy, of dynastic faith? You can almost hear echoes of that question in every later empire that fell. Rome, Byzantium, the Qing. When power grows too rigid to bend, the world ensures it breaks. And yet there's something poetic about how humanity always rebuilds. After the Bronze Age's fall, the alphabet spread. Simpler scripts replaced complex cuneiform. Trade resumed leaner and more resilient. Kings returned humbler, at least for a while. In a sense, the collapse didn't erase civilization. It democratized it. Knowledge once trapped in temple archives began to move through merchants, sailors, and storytellers. What had been sacred became shared. Here's your light joke for the night. Maybe the Bronze Age gods just rage-quit history. They'd built their empires, watched them glitch, and decided to reinstall humanity from scratch. Patch 2.0 now with iron swords and better alphabet support. But humor aside, there's an unsettling truth beneath the ash. Collapse in human history isn't always failure. Sometimes it's the only way the world learns to grow again. Civilization doesn't fall, it molts. Each shedding of skin brings sharper tools, wiser myths, and stronger foundations. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't the end of dynasty. It was its purification, a cleansing that turned dust into the seedbed of future kings. And as you brush your hand against the blackened stones of Ugarit or Mycenae, you can almost feel the pulse of renewal still humming beneath. Out of devastation came reinvention. Out of silence came song. And the dust, always the dust, remembered. When the dust settled, something unexpected happened. Humanity started building again. not as it once had, but smarter, leaner, and strangely more connected. The survivors of the Bronze Age collapse didn't just cling to ruins, they transformed them into blueprints. Across the Mediterranean from the Aegean coast to the banks of the Nile, a quiet renaissance began. New trade routes emerged, new political systems formed, and forgotten knowledge resurfaced, though often in altered form, half-remembered and reimagined. This was the dawn of the Iron Age, the first global reboot. The gods were quieter, their temples fewer, but their echoes lived on in human ambition. Archaeology paints this transition not as chaos, but adaptation. Pottery styles change scripts, simplify metallurgy advances. It's as if people collectively decided that survival required reinvention. In Greece, the so-called Dark Age birthed the seeds of democracy. In the Levant, small kingdoms, Israel, Phoenicia, Aram, rose where empires had fallen. Egypt withdrew inward, conserving what little it had left. The mighty became modest. The scattered became strong. The Phoenicians especially emerged as the great architects of renewal. Descendants of Canaanite city-states like Tyre and Sidon, they inherited fragments of the old world's maritime knowledge and expanded upon it. Their ships cut across the sea like veins reconnecting a fractured world. They didn't conquer, they traded, they taught, they spread ideas. Most importantly, they gave humanity a gift more enduring than gold, the alphabet. Where cuneiform and hieroglyphs had been sacred scripts, accessible only to scribes and priests. The Phoenician alphabet was simple, learnable, replicable. 22 symbols could capture every sound of speech. With it, literacy began to spread beyond temple walls. Empires would later weaponize it, philosophers would refine it, and storytellers like us would use it to remember. Imagine the contrast. Once every tablet of knowledge required hours of carving. Now messages could be written quickly on papyrus or parchment. The speed of communication changed everything. In a world rebuilding from collapse, information became the new lifeblood. Trade contracts, navigational charts, royal decrees, they all moved faster, uniting distant coasts. The alphabet was civilization's reset button. But the deeper question remains, who guided this rebirth? Was it mere coincidence that after centuries of silence, so many cultures rediscovered progress almost simultaneously? Or did remnants of the old order survive hidden in priestly archives? Refugee scholars or merchant guilds that quietly carried memory across generations? There are tantalizing clues. Some scholars point to evidence of continuity between the late Bronze and early Iron Ages, subtle similarities in architecture, ritual, and engineering that suggest knowledge didn't die, it adapted. Others see this as proof of a hidden transmission, that somewhere in secret sanctuaries or traveling brotherhoods, fragments of the old world's wisdom endured, waiting for a chance to reemerge. The Greeks would later speak of the architects, legendary figures like Daedalus, who crafted wonders and guided kings. The Hebrews spoke of skilled builders descended from those who once served Solomon and Hiram of Tyre. Egypt had its own archetype, Imhotep, the divine architect who became a god of knowledge long after his death. Across cultures, the myth of the master builder reappears, suggesting an archetype rooted in historical memory. Could these figures represent the same tradition, echoing through different names and eras, a lineage of craftsmen, engineers, and scholars who kept the light of knowledge alive through the dark? If so, then the rebuilding of the post-collapse world wasn't random, it was guided. Consider the emergence of monumental architecture again, in the Iron Age, the early Greek temples, the Assyrian palaces, the massive fortifications at Carchemish and Megiddo. These were not crude restarts, they were evolutions. The masons who carved them knew geometry, proportion, acoustics, all inherited, refined, and redeployed. Civilization, it seems, never truly forgets. It only reconfigures memory into form. And perhaps that's the hidden truth of Dynasty, not just bloodlines of rulers, but bloodlines of builders. The men and women who preserve continuity through craft. From the brickmakers of Mesopotamia to the shipwrights of Phoenicia, they were the true dynasts of civilization, turning dust into permanence. In this light, from dust to dynasty takes on new meaning. The dynasty isn't merely political, it's intellectual. Each generation inherits fragments of the old world and reshapes them for survival. The cycle of fall and renewal becomes less about power and more about preservation, an unbroken chain of human persistence. So when we speak of the Iron Age rising from the Bronze, we're not describing a technological upgrade. We're witnessing the resilience of civilization itself. From shattered archives and burned palaces came something subtler and stronger, a world built not by gods, but by memory. And somewhere within that memory, the architects of renewal left their mark not in monuments, but in method. The blueprint for rebuilding a fallen world. Centuries after the fires faded and the ruins cooled, the world began to hum again with ambition. Across the Mediterranean and beyond, fragments of memory were stitched back into crowns. Kingdoms rose where tribes once wandered. Cities that had lain quiet for generations began to breathe brick by brick into something resembling order. And at the center of it all, not merchants, not priests, but kings returned. Yet these were not the same kings who had once claimed to rule by divine decree. The Iron Age monarchs wore legitimacy differently. Their thrones were not inherited from gods, but from stories, and stories, as we know, are far harder to kill than empires. In the hills of Greece, new city-states began to carve their own myths. They claimed descent from heroes Achilles Heracles, or some half-divine ancestor whose name still shimmered in the ruins of Homer's verse. These weren't genealogies in the biological sense, but in the narrative one. To rule was to remember. To reign was to retell. Elsewhere in the Near East, Assyria returned with a vengeance. Out of the ashes of the Bronze Age, it reinvented itself as the world's first truly militarized empire. Its kings, Tiglath-Pileser, Sargon-Sennacherib, no longer presented themselves as mere intermediaries of divine will. They became the embodiment of empire itself, organized, relentless, terrifyingly efficient. Theirs was the power of bureaucracy fused with brutality. And yet beneath the steel and stone, you can still feel the whisper of Sumer, the same obsession with order, legacy, and permanence. The dynasty reborn in harder armor. It's strange how civilizations seem to remember without memory. The Assyrians built their palaces on the very foundations of earlier Sumerian cities, their inscriptions echoing ancient formulas that had been old even in Hammurabi's time. The Greeks rediscovered writing through the borrowed Phoenician alphabet, unknowingly reviving a tradition that stretched back to the scribes of Uruk. Egypt, tired and fragmented, reassembled itself under Nubian and later Sayate rulers, who consciously imitated the art and theology of their old kingdom ancestors. Everywhere you look, the new kings weren't just ruling, they were reconstructing the past as blueprint. And perhaps this is why every rebirth feels familiar. Civilization doesn't start from zero. It starts from fragments, myths, ruins, inherited habits of thought. The Iron Age monarchies weren't copying the past. They were channeling it as if some deep civilizational instinct told them how to rebuild. One might even call it genetic memory, except it wasn't written in DNA but in stone and story. The temple blueprints, the divine titles, the rituals of coronation, they all carried echoes of an older rhythm. When an Assyrian king ascended the throne, he performed offerings first to the gods of Uruk and Babylon cities. His ancestors had never seen, but whose names still carried the weight of eternity. When a Greek ruler commissioned a temple, he built it not for a local spirit, but for a pantheon that already felt ancient to him. The gods returned because the kings did. But the return of kingship wasn't only political. It was psychological. Humanity, exhausted by centuries of collapse and chaos, seemed to crave hierarchy, again a figure to gather the fragments into a narrative. The king became the personification of memory itself, a vessel for the past, a promise of continuity. Still, the kings of this new age faced a different challenge. Legitimacy had to be earned, not assumed. In Assyria, it came from conquest. In Israel, it came from covenant. In Greece, it came from persuasion, a shift that would in time plant the seed for democracy. Each civilization began to negotiate its relationship to power, rather than simply submit to it. The dynastic idea survived, but it evolved no longer divine command, but collective memory made flesh. There's an obscure Assyrian text that scholars love to puzzle over the ritual of kingship renewal. Once a year, the king was stripped of his crown, slapped by a priest, and forced to confess his failings before the gods. Only if he wept sincerely was he deemed worthy to rule another year. It's a haunting ritual, one that seems to acknowledge that kingship is a fragile performance, not a divine right. The dynasty, too, had learned humility. Meanwhile, in Egypt, pharaohs of the 26th dynasty styled themselves as restorers, consciously reviving old kingdom titles, archaic art, and forgotten rituals. Their palaces were filled with replicas of artifacts thousands of years old. They weren't trying to innovate, they were trying to remember. To them, legitimacy was not in novelty, but in continuity. The past itself had become sacred currency. And yet, even as each kingdom claimed to resurrect a golden age, none realized they were all participating in the same pattern, the cycle of dust and dynasty memory and rebirth. The kings who returned weren't heirs of divine blood, they were heirs of civilization's stubborn refusal to forget. Maybe that's the true secret of power, not the sword, not the temple, but the story. Whoever controls memory controls meaning. And whoever controls meaning inevitably becomes king. Every empire dreams of permanence. The farmers want good harvests, the merchants want safe roads, but kings' kings want eternity. They want their names carved into the landscape so deeply that even the wind remembers them. It's an almost childlike wish, really. And yet, from Babylon to Rome, every great civilization tried to make it real. The quest for the eternal city wasn't just architectural, it was psychological. It was humanity's attempt to trap time. You can trace this longing through the skyline of ancient power. Babylon's walls were said to be so wide that chariots could race along them. At its center rose the Etemenanki, the temple tower that inspired the biblical Tower of Babel, a stairway not to heaven, but to memory. The Babylonians didn't just build cities, they built cosmic models. Every ziggurat mirrored the structure of the universe, base as earth, middle as sky, top as the realm of the gods. A blueprint not just for buildings, but for belief. When Nebuchadnezzar II rebuilt Babylon around 600 BCE, he wasn't innovating, he was resurrecting. In his inscriptions, he often described himself as the restorer of ancient foundations. That phrase appears again and again across Mesopotamian history, as if the act of rebuilding was itself sacred. To make something new was meaningless. To make something eternal was divine. Even their city planning followed ritual geometry, the main gate aligned to the rising sun on the spring equinox, the temples arranged to echo constellations overhead. Rome, centuries later, would inherit this obsession, wholesale, though the Romans, being Romans, gave it a bureaucratic twist. They didn't just build one eternal city. They replicated it across the empire. Every Roman colony from Gaul to North Africa followed the same plan, two main streets crossing at right angles, the Forum at the heart temples, aligned along sacred axes. To stand in a Roman outpost was to stand inside the empire's memory. They exported eternity through urban planning. What's remarkable is how this template recurs independently across time and geography. The Indus Valleys, Harappa, and Mohenjo-Daro were laid out with perfect grid precision nearly 2,000 years before Rome. Chinese capitals from Xi'an to Luoyang were aligned to cardinal directions and celestial markers, serving as literal embodiments of cosmic order. Even the Mayan city of Tikal followed alignments that tracked the sun's movement through the year. Across continents that never met humanity kept reaching for the same architectural formula, the eternal pattern of heaven mirrored on earth. Some archaeologists argue this repetition is coincidence. Others whisper that it's something deeper, a shared symbolic language passed down through forgotten migrations, or even earlier civilizations now erased from record. Either way, the impulse is unmistakable. A city must not only function, it must signify. When you walk through the ruins of these ancient capitals, it's not the stones that speak, it's the symmetry. The straight streets, the deliberate sight lines, the way a temple frames the sunrise on a particular morning of the year. It's as if the builders were trying to negotiate with time itself. See, they seem to say, we understand the rules. We've built according to your pattern. Spare us. In Babylon, eternity was written in brick. In Rome, it was encoded in law. But in both, the blueprint carried the same message: permanence through repetition. The Roman Senate, aware that even their empire might one day crumble, decreed that the city's boundaries could never be officially closed. Rome could shrink, burn, or rot, but symbolically it had to remain infinite. They called it Urbs Aeterna, the eternal city, because admitting its mortality would break the spell. There's an obscure inscription from late Babylon that survives only in fragments. It reads, "We rebuild because the world is rebuilt." A strange sentiment, half mystical, half pragmatic. It implies that the act of constructing cities was an imitation of creation itself. When kings ordered walls to rise, they were reenacting the formation of cosmos from chaos. Every new foundation was a rehearsal of Genesis, and maybe that's why failure didn't frighten them. When Babylon fell, its conquerors rebuilt. When Rome burned Nero and later Hadrian restored it again. Each rebuilding wasn't just recovery, it was renewal. Destruction in this logic wasn't an end, it was part of the cycle. Dust to dynasty, ruin to rebirth. Eternity wasn't about never dying, it was about always returning. The same architectural formula reached even further east. In China, the Tang capital of Chang'an was a living grid of cosmic harmony, its central avenue aligned with the pole star, the axis of heaven itself. And when that city fell later, dynasties rebuilt new capitals along the same plan. Just like the Romans, they treated the city not as a location, but as a principle, a pattern to be reactivated whenever empire demanded form. All of this leads to one unsettling question: did the ancients know that permanence is an illusion, that the eternal city is not built of stone but of repetition, the act of recreating the same idea over and over? Perhaps that was the secret all along. Babylon fell, Rome burned, yet both still live in our architecture, our governments, even our languages. The blueprint survived because it was never physical. It was mental, a geometry of order that refuses to die. So when we marvel at the colonnades of Rome or the shadowed ziggurats of Mesopotamia, what we're seeing is not just history. We're seeing a transmission, a message passed through hands and centuries. We built to remember. You rebuild to remain. Fire destroys, but it also remembers. When libraries burn, the heat lifts words into the air like ghosts, and something in humanity refuses to let them go. From the earliest dynasties to the modern age, the fire that consumes civilizations always leaves behind embers of meaning, a faint glow that future generations kindle into new myths, new orders, new dynasties. That's the paradox of legacy. It's both fragile and immortal. And nowhere is that tension clearer than in how ancient rulers tried to outwit oblivion. They built monuments and laws, wove genealogies and songs, wrote their names into every brick. But in the end, their survival depended on memory, not matter. Matter burns. Memory spreads. Consider Mesopotamia's cuneiform tablets, small, unassuming rectangles of baked clay covered in wedge-shaped marks. They were once administrative records, grain rations, temple accounts, lists of kings. Yet those dry fragments, buried for millennia, became the fuel for modern archaeology's greatest rediscovery. When the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal was unearthed at Nineveh, it was like hearing a lost civilization breathe again. The Assyrian king had gathered thousands of tablets not to read, but to preserve. He called them my treasure of wisdom. And though Nineveh fell in fire, his archive survived because clay, unlike paper, does not burn. His city perished, but his mind endured. You can trace that same instinct, the fear of being forgotten, across every culture that followed. The Egyptians perfected it. Their tombs were not graves, but engines of immortality, each inscribed with spells designed to keep the name alive. The pharaohs didn't believe they'd live forever in the body. They believed they'd live forever in memory. To erase a name, to chisel it from a wall, was to kill the person twice. That's why even today you can still whisper Ramses, and somewhere in the deep logic of legacy, the king stirs. But fire has its own way of editing history. When Alexandria's library burned, whether by accident or decree, we'll never know, the flames didn't end knowledge. They redistributed it. Fragments survived in copies carried to Constantinople, to Baghdad, to the monasteries of Ireland. What the blaze destroyed, the diaspora of memory restored. There's something almost cosmic about it, information refusing to vanish, scattering like stars. In that sense, every empire's death becomes a kind of transcription. The Assyrian archives became Babylon's foundation myths. Babylon's legends inspired the Jewish exile's theology. That theology later informed Rome's own self-conception as the chosen empire. Through every flame, a spark jumps forward. You can follow that current all the way to us. We are in a way the last dynasty of the first fire. There's an obscure passage in an Akkadian hymn that reads, "What the flood drowns, the wind retells." It's poetic, yes, but also true. Every civilization has faced its flood, its catastrophe, its collapse. Yet each time humanity found a way to retell itself, to lift its story from the ashes and rebuild its mythic structure. We might lose the buildings, but not the blueprint. The torch keeps passing. Think of how the Greeks borrowed from Egypt and Babylon, how they reimagined divine kingship as heroism, mortal men, elevated by memory rather than by blood. Then Rome took Greek culture, burned away the gods, and crowned history itself as divine. Later, the Christian world inherited Rome's architecture and Babylon's longing for eternity, transforming it into the celestial city, a kingdom not of earth, but of heaven. Fire turned empires into metaphors. There's something almost mischievous about it, the way destruction sharpens meaning. When the Parthenon became a ruin, it turned from temple to symbol. When the Colosseum crumbled, it became a sermon on time's triumph. When Constantinople fell, its relics traveled west, seeding the Renaissance. The fall of empires isn't just tragedy, it's transmission. Fire again as courier of memory. But there's another kind of fire, not the one that burns, but the one that glows quietly in the dark. The fire of remembrance. It's in the scholar unrolling a scroll, the pilgrim touching a ruin, the archivist copying a fading text by candlelight. That gentle flame, that refusal to let silence win, is how legacy survives its own pyres. And maybe that's the secret the ancients intuited. They didn't fear death so much as erasure. To die was natural. To be forgotten was unforgivable. So they wove themselves into every possible medium stone song scripture. Some went as far as encoding their names in astronomical cycles, aligning monuments with stars, so that every dawn would repeat their story. The pharaoh's face carved on the horizon wasn't vanity, it was insurance. The sun would remember him even if men did not. The continuity between Babylon, Rome, and us is not political, but psychological. We all burn for remembrance. Every dynasty, every civilization, every person builds some small monument, a word, a wall, a recording, hoping it might outlast the dust. And though time erases almost everything, it always leaves something. A trace, a spark. In that light, the fire of legacy isn't destruction at all. It's the flame that refuses to go out, flickering through centuries of ruin. Empires fall, but the story endures, retold, reimagined, reignited. And as long as we remember, the kings are never truly gone. Imagine a great mechanism hidden beneath the centuries' invisible gears of power, turning in perfect rhythm. Empires rise, collapse, and rise again, not through luck or divine will, but through this silent machinery. Once the first rulers discovered how to turn it, the pattern never stopped. The dynasty machine, as it might be called, doesn't just build kingdoms, it builds the illusion that they were meant to exist. You see it most clearly in the bureaucratic bones of empire. Take ancient Egypt, where each pharaoh's reign was framed as both renewal and repetition. The rituals of coronation, the temple offerings, even the wording of royal decrees, all were replicas of the same divine pattern. A king wasn't crowned, he was rebooted. The entire structure of rule depended on pretending that nothing ever changed. Continuity was stability. And stability in a world so fragile was the highest form of magic. The machine was perfected when order became paperwork. The Sumerians may have invented writing, but it was the Babylonians who discovered its real power: administration. Clay tablets didn't just record trade, they defined reality. If a name was written in the archive, it existed. If it wasn't, it didn't. Bureaucracy in its earliest form was a kind of spell, a means of making the abstract tangible. It turned a sack of grain into an entry into a statistic, and a statistic into control. That's how kings ruled from afar, not through whips or swords, but through lists. There's a reason the first empires loved cycles and ledgers. Power thrives on predictability. Every temple tax, every census, every festival calendar was part of the same feedback loop. The king collected offerings, the priests sanctified them, the scribes recorded them, and the people obeyed because the gods demanded it. It was a closed-circuit divine order flowing through human institutions. The dynasty machine was self-fueling. But machines evolve. When one empire fell, the next didn't start from scratch. It inherited the blueprints, the administrative logic, the legal formulas, the theology of rule. The Akkadians borrowed Sumerian rituals. The Assyrians borrowed Akkadian bureaucracy. The Persians refined both into something astonishingly modern. Under Darius the Great, the Persian Empire built what could easily be called the first global operating system. Roads for data, couriers as processors, satrapies as regional servers. Everything connected, everything monitored. The eyes of the king traveled across thousands of miles, inspecting provinces like a system check. Darius wasn't ruling by sword alone. He was managing information. Rome, of course, industrialized it. Where Persia centralized, Rome standardized. Bureaucracy became empire as infrastructure. Citizenship, taxation law, all designed to make the empire self-replicating. Even after emperors died, the system ran on. Officials served the office, not the man. The Romans had built something terrifyingly close to immortality governance that didn't depend on genius-only procedure. You could remove the head, and the body would still function. And yet, for all its order, the machine always needed oil belief. Power only works when people agree to pretend. The pharaoh claimed divinity. The citizens of Rome worshipped the state itself. Medieval monarchs invoked the divine right of kings, a clever software update that preserved hierarchy in a world that had long forgotten living gods. Each iteration grew subtler, less divine, more institutional. But the underlying code, obedience through ritual, legitimacy through memory, stayed the same. Some historians argue that dynasties fall because they rot. Others say they fall because the world changes faster than their gears can turn. But maybe it's simpler. Maybe the machine was never meant to stop, it just changes operators. When Babylon fell, Persia rose. When Persia broke, Greece took the mantle. When Greece faded, Rome copied its settings and improved the interface. Even the fall of Rome didn't break the machine. It merely split into regional versions, Byzantium, Christendom, the caliphates. There's a delicious irony here. Every new dynasty claims to be revolutionary, to restore justice, truth, purity. Yet what they really do is reboot the same program with a new brand logo. The paperwork changes language. The rituals swap gods. But deep down, it's all the same rhythm: birth, consolidation, stagnation, collapse. And then from the rubble, a familiar hum begins again. Modern historians call it civilizational recurrence. The ancients might have called it fate. Either way, it's hard not to sense the mechanical precision of it. Even rebellion feeds the gears. When peasants revolt, they destroy the palace but preserve the idea of it. Someone must still rule, someone must still decide. The structure resets around a new center, like a machine repairing itself mid-motion. Of course, there are moments when the mechanism glitches, times when humanity seems poised to escape its cycle. The late Bronze Age collapse should have ended centralized power for good. The trade routes shattered, writing disappeared, cities emptied, and yet within a few generations, the same structures re-emerged. Kingdoms, priests, taxes, kings. It's as if the very concept of order once invented could never be uninvented. An obscure Babylonian proverb captures it perfectly: the wheel turns, but the axle endures. Dynasties rise and fall, but the principles that sustain them, hierarchy, record-keeping, ritualized control, remain. Even today, we're still turning that wheel. Our governments are digital pharaohs, our data, the new tablets of clay. The empire has gone wireless, but the machine still hums. Maybe that's the true legacy of civilization, not monuments or art, but the self-perpetuating pattern of power. A design so efficient, it can outlive its creators. You can dismantle the palace brick by brick, melt the crown, burn the archives, and yet give it time, and the same structure will assemble itself somewhere else. The machine doesn't care about names. It only needs motion. And as you trace the lineage of empires, Sumer to Rome, Rome to us, you start to realize the unsettling truth: civilization itself is the dynasty. Humanity is merely the operator briefly seated at the console before the next hand takes over. Every civilization that mastered power eventually sought to master time. If the dynasty machine ensured continuity, the next logical step was permanence to become immortal, not in flesh, but in form. Blueprints of Immortality explores this strange ambition, how ancient rulers, architects, and philosophers tried to cheat decay by embedding eternity into the structures of their world. It begins with the tombs, those colossal prototypes of forever. The pyramids of Egypt weren't just graves, they were time-proof equations. Their alignment to the stars, their perfect geometry, their unyielding mass, all of it was designed to communicate across millennia. To stand as both message and monument, every limestone block whispered the same defiance: we will not be forgotten. And yet the pharaohs themselves vanished, their names eroded to dust while the geometry endured. The design, not the designer, survived. Mesopotamian ziggurats followed the same principle but inverted it. Where Egypt sought permanence in the heavens, the Sumerians built stairways for gods to descend. Their immortality was not vertical, but cyclical, rebuilt, repurposed, reused by each succeeding power. The gods changed names, but the blueprint remained. You can trace it directly from the ziggurat of Ur to the Tower of Babel myth, to Babylon's hanging terraces, to Persia's fire temples. The structures evolved, but the idea connecting heaven and earth through architecture was never abandoned. In every empire that came after architecture became theology in stone. The Greeks perfected proportion. The Romans industrialized it. With concrete, they made permanence portable. Temples, aqueducts, amphitheaters, all modular, replicable, eternal in concept, if not in material. It was the ultimate imperial trick: when you can reproduce eternity, you no longer need gods. But immortality isn't just built, it's codified. After architecture came law. Hammurabi's code carved justice into basalt. The Roman 12 tables engraved governance into civic memory. These weren't just legal documents. They were attempts to freeze order, to make human behavior predictable across generations. A king's word fades. A law written in stone endures. Civilization, for the first time, achieved self-reference. It could consult itself. Every blueprint of immortality carried the same paradox: permanence required change. A dynasty that refused to evolve fossilized. One that evolved too quickly dissolved. So the successful ones built systems flexible enough to bend without breaking. The Chinese dynastic model, the mandate of heaven, was genius in this sense. It encoded failure as renewal. A dynasty could fall honorably if heaven withdrew its favor, allowing another to rise with legitimacy. The concept itself never died. It simply reloaded under new management. Religions followed suit. The great monotheisms absorbed local gods, reinterpreted myths, adjusted rituals, always preserving the structure beneath the change. The continuity wasn't theological, it was psychological. Humans crave pattern, legacy, and memory. The builders of eternity understood this better than anyone. Even philosophy joined the project. Plato's theory of forms, Aristotle's eternal cosmos, the Stoic logos, all attempts to locate unchanging truth within the shifting world. The philosophers, in their own way, built cathedrals of thought. And like the pyramids, their designs survived long after the architects were gone. By the Middle Ages, immortality had become institutional. Cathedrals, universities, monarchies, all crafted as living systems that outlast their founders. The medieval mind saw continuity as holiness. Every stone laid in a church was an act of resurrection, of memory rebuilt as matter. The blueprint had matured. But somewhere in the Renaissance, the dream twisted. Humanism turned immortality inward. Artists and scholars began building themselves instead of monuments. I think therefore I am became the new ziggurat. The individual became the vessel of eternity, not the state, not the temple. Yet even here the pattern persisted. What are art, literature, and legacy if not new architectural languages for the same desire? Today our blueprints are digital. We build databases instead of temples, archives instead of tombs. Our names, once carved into stone, now live in code. And while it feels revolutionary, it's ancient in spirit. The pharaoh's cartouche, Hammurabi's stele, the emperor's decree, all reborn as metadata. The medium changed. The obsession didn't. There's an eerie sense that humanity has been following one master design, that the real dynasty isn't royal, but structural. Architecture, law, memory, data, all components of an evolving project, to make ourselves unerasable. But perhaps the oldest paradox still applies: the closer we get to eternity, the less human we become. The pharaoh's tomb entombed him. Our digital afterlife may do the same. The ancients tried to speak to eternity through stone. We do it through servers. And if the past has taught us anything, it's that every blueprint of immortality eventually becomes a ruin, or worse, a prison. When a civilization falls, it doesn't truly vanish. It merely sinks layer by layer into the soil of time, waiting for someone else to build upon its bones. The archaeology of rebirth begins in that silent aftermath, in the dust-choked gap between one empire's last breath and another's first stone. You stand in the ruins of Ugarit, where once the sea whispered to merchants and priests. The city burned so completely that its library was baked into permanence. Centuries later, when the tablets were unearthed, their stories still spoke hymns to gods. No one remembered trade accounts from ports that no longer existed, fragments of a world unaware it was ending. Yet even in that destruction, there was creation. The ash sealed knowledge, preserved syntax, and immortalized the shape of thought. Civilization, it turns out, has always been its own archaeologist. Archaeologists often joke that digging is a form of resurrection, but the truth is more circular. Every great power inherits a graveyard. Babylon rose on Sumer's dust. Rome quarried the marble of Greece. Medieval Europe literally built cathedrals out of Roman rubble. Each layer is both tomb and foundation. To rebuild is to remember and to rewrite. This cycle began not as metaphor but necessity. When the Bronze Age collapsed, survivors scavenged temples for bricks, reused statues, repurposed gods. A Hittite storm deity might become a Phoenician sailor's protector, or a Canaanite merchant's charm. The divine, too, was recycled. Myth mutated to fit new mouths, new languages, new empires. The gods didn't die. They changed jobs. Yet beneath the practical lies something more profound: the awareness that destruction feeds continuity. To create, you must first clear. In Egypt, when dynasties shifted, old temples were ritually killed, names of previous rulers chiseled out, their monuments rededicated. The erasure wasn't denial. It was transformation. Memory was edited, not deleted. Archaeologists uncover this logic everywhere. Roman Britain hides beneath London's streets. Aztec temples lie under Mexico City's cathedrals. In Istanbul, the Hagia Sophia still wears the bones of three vanished worlds, pagan, Christian, and Islamic, each layer claiming eternity, but leaving space for the next. Humanity, it seems, cannot resist building atop ghosts. The controversial detail. Some scholars argue that this layering isn't accidental but engineered, that ancient planners deliberately built cities on old sacred sites to harness what they called numinous residue, the lingering power of place. When archaeologists mapped ancient shrines in Mesopotamia, they found uncanny alignments, new temples stacked precisely over older ones, as if the blueprint itself demanded continuity. Even after a city was destroyed, its coordinates were remembered. The Earth itself became an archive. It raises a question that continues to divide historians. Do civilizations subconsciously seek the ruins of their ancestors? Or does something in those ruins call them back? The answer shifts depending on who's asking. The scientist says geography. The mystic says gravity of memory. The poet says destiny. But whatever the cause, the pattern is unmistakable. Every rebirth grows from ruin. This looping of life and decay was not always tragic. In many ancient cosmologies, rebirth was the highest law. The Egyptian sun god died each night only to rise again. The Maya believed time itself was cyclical ages ending in fire and reborn in dawn. Even the Christian resurrection myth, though unique in tone, follows an older template: salvation through decay, eternity through ending. You could argue that the entire human story is a theology of recycling. The callback from earlier chapters is clear now. When the first kings etched their names in stone, they were not seeking fame, they were trying to leave instructions. Each dynasty became a blueprint for the next, consciously or not. The Sumerian city grids echoed in Rome's imperial cult resurfaced in medieval coronations. The bureaucratic tablets of Ur anticipated the tax ledgers of every empire thereafter. Civilization's rebirth isn't repetition. It's recursion, each age remembering differently. Still, there's irony here. The more we study ruins, the more we realize how much we've forgotten. For every artifact unearthed, 10,000 crumble unnoticed. Entire civilizations have slipped through the cracks, their stories existing only as negative space, the absence that defines what remains. We resurrect fragments, not wholes, yet maybe that's enough. Perhaps humanity's genius isn't preservation, but reinterpretation. We don't keep the past. We translate it. We don't revive the old gods. We rename them. The past lives in the way we use its debris: a fresco repainted, a myth rewritten, a law rephrased. As you brush the dust from a broken amphora or read a law tablet scorched by conquest, you realize the truth: rebirth is archaeology. Every innovation is an excavation of something older. Every new world is an ancient one rebuilt with slightly different hands. And maybe that's what immortality really looks like: not untouched perfection, but endless restoration. The phoenix isn't eternal because it never dies. It's eternal because it always does. If history had a heartbeat, it would sound like repetition. Rise, flourish, decay, rebirth. The pulse of empire has always followed the same rhythm, whether written in cuneiform, carved in marble, or printed in digital pixels. The pattern of empire begins where the dust of one civilization still clings to the bricks of the next, asking a question that seems almost heretical. What if this repetition isn't a flaw, but the design itself? You've seen this rhythm before. From Mesopotamia's flood myths to Rome's imperial collapse, every empire tells the same story in a different accent. The beginning always starts with chaos, scattered tribes, empty plains, rivers waiting to be named. Then comes unification, a strong leader, a lawgiver, a builder who raises order from the mud. Prosperity follows. Art flourishes, borders expand, and then, like an exhausted flame, decline. Internal rot, corruption, famine, rebellion, the same shadows every time, until the collapse is complete, and silence waits for a new architect to lay the first stone again. Historians have long argued about why this pattern exists. Some blame environment, the exhaustion of soil, the drying of rivers, the cooling of trade winds. Others see it as the mathematics of complexity: systems that grow too vast, too interdependent, inevitably implode. Yet there's another, quieter explanation, one whispered by archaeologists and mythologists alike. that civilizations choose to collapse. That after centuries of rigid hierarchy and cultural fatigue, societies unconsciously seek renewal through destruction. Like a snake shedding skin, they dissolve in order to be reborn. Think back to Sumer. The world's first dynasty fell not because of conquest, but because its own irrigation choked the land with salt. The farmers abandoned their fields, and the desert reclaimed their temples. Yet from that ruin rose Babylon, a city that carried Sumer's language, gods, and mathematics, but reinvented its soul. The same soil, new seed. Egypt followed a similar rhythm, three great kingdoms, each separated by centuries of chaos. The pharaohs themselves recognized the pattern, carving it into theology. Order Mayat must always struggle against disorder Isfet. Balance was never meant to be permanent. It was a dance. The Egyptians didn't fear collapse, they ritualized it. Fast forward to Rome, the empire that refused to learn moderation. Its rulers watched the republic rot from within, and when the end came, they built cathedrals on its corpse. The Holy Roman Empire, Byzantium, the papacy, all spiritual successors trying to reanimate the same imperial body. Rome never died. It metastasized. The pattern even echoes in the far corners of the world. The dynastic cycles of China described the mandate of heaven, a moral algorithm dictating rise and fall. When rulers became corrupt, heaven withdrew its favor. Floods, rebellions, and famine followed divine signals that the throne should pass. Collapse wasn't failure, it was renewal. Each dynasty began with virtue and ended in decadence, and the process started again, clean and inevitable. There's an obscure interpretation, though one that some historians hesitate to print, that these cycles are not spontaneous, but encoded. The first cities, Sumer, Egypt, Indus, Yellow River, all emerged around 3100 BCE with suspicious simultaneity. The first collapses came in parallel 2 centuries later. Each major Renaissance, classical Greece, Han, China, Gupta, India, seemed to align with global pulses of rebirth. Climate records, solar cycles, and trade data hint at synchronization across continents that supposedly never met. It's as if civilization itself operates on a timer. The callback is clear. Remember the builder's code from earlier, those architects who shared geometry and alignment across empires. This may be their legacy, not a literal blueprint, but a metaphysical one. A pattern etched into human behavior, perhaps even biology. The urge to rise, the arrogance to overreach, the wisdom to rebuild. Modern thinkers have begun comparing empire to ecosystems, self-regulating organisms that collapse to prevent total extinction. When a forest burns, nutrients return to the soil. When an empire falls, it releases technology, art, and ideas that feed the next growth. The Bronze Age collapse birthed iron tools. Rome's fall birthed the Renaissance. The Industrial Revolutions emerged from colonial decay. Catastrophe, as it turns out, is civilization's fertilizer. But there's an open question that scholars can't agree on. Are we doomed to repeat, or are we simply rehearsing for something larger? If every cycle brings greater reach, from river valleys to global trade networks to space colonies, then perhaps history isn't circular at all. Perhaps it's a spiral ascending through recurrence toward something unseen. Each empire is a turn of the same coil, moving higher even as it loops back. And yet, there's always the warning. The larger the system, the louder the collapse. The digital empire we inhabit now, invisible borders, algorithmic rulers, endless archives, feels eerily familiar. We call it progress, but it hums with ancient energy. Bureaucracy, monumentalism, centralization. Every hallmark of past decline is written in code instead of stone. You can almost feel history sharpening its chisel. Still, there's comfort in the inevitability. If fall and rebirth are twins, then collapse isn't an apocalypse, it's an interval. Civilization doesn't die. it dreams. And when it wakes, it rebuilds, always remembering something it once forgot. The dust of the past is never wasted. It's waiting. As you stand in the ruins of the old world, or perhaps the foundations of the next, you begin to sense that history isn't a line or a circle, but a heartbeat. Rise, fall, rise again. Maybe that's the only pattern we'll ever need to understand. You can feel it now, the faint vibration beneath everything. A pulse older than language, steadier than empire, running through every city, every dynasty, every ruin we've walked through so far. It's the thread that ties dust to dynasty myth, to monument birth, to collapse. The secret thread of civilization isn't a metaphor. It's the quiet, continuous transmission that has kept humanity's idea of civilization alive, even when every empire that carried it turned to ash. You begin to see it first in the survivors. After every collapse, there's always a handful who refuse to vanish, scribes who bury tablets before fleeing, priests who memorize the liturgy of dead gods, artisans who carry their measurements across continents. These people are not kings, not conquerors, they're couriers. They move between worlds unnoticed, ferrying knowledge like contraband. When the Hittites burned, their ironworkers wandered west, whispering their craft into Greek hands. When Babylon fell, its astrologers found work in Persian courts. When Rome crumbled, its monks tucked fragments of Aristotle between psalms. Civilization never breaks, it migrates. And through those migrations, something curious happens. The tools change, the symbols mutate, but the structure remains. Every new empire begins with a seed from the one before. The temple becomes a palace, the palace becomes a parliament, the king's edict becomes a constitution. Different faces, same architecture. Like a recurring dream that refuses to fade, the pattern of governance, law, and ritual persists, refined but recognizable. The Sumerian administrator with his clay tablets and the modern bureaucrat with her spreadsheet are two expressions of the same impulse to bind chaos with record, to impose meaning through order. There's an obscure theory whispered among a few anthropologists and dismissed by most historians that this continuity might be intentional, not incidental. They call it the civilizational relay, the idea that knowledge systems are designed to survive their carriers, that buried libraries, coded myths, and enduring symbols act as software for the human species, re-uploaded after every crash. The torch passes not just through time, but through collapse itself. Consider the parallels. The flood myths of Mesopotamia and Mesoamerica, the sacred geometries of Egypt and Angkor, the dynastic logic that links the mandate of heaven to divine right kingship, to modern constitutionalism. These aren't coincidences. They're redundancies, the same code rewritten in different languages to ensure survival. Civilization may appear fragile, but it's built on duplication. When one copy burns, another waits in a different hand. Even the notion of divinity plays its part. The gods may shift names. Enlil becomes Zeus, becomes Jupiter, becomes Yahweh. But their function remains to sanctify structure, to moralize hierarchy, to remind mortals that their order is part of something cosmic. You might say the divine was civilization's first encryption moral software, ensuring continuity beyond reason. And now, thousands of years later, you can still trace the line. From cuneiform to code, from the first ledger scratched into clay to the blockchain's endless chain of records, we are still trying to remember ourselves. Each era believes it is the first to invent permanence, yet every innovation echoes a forgotten solution. Writing was the first cloud storage. Law, the first operating system. Ritual, the first algorithm for meaning. Earlier, when we explored the builder's code, the question lingered. Were these connections coincidence or inheritance? Now the evidence leans toward the latter. Trade routes, conquests, diasporas. Yes, they explain movement, but not memory. Not the uncanny sameness of cities' stories and social structures across time. Something more deliberate is at play. Civilization has memory. Not the fragile kind held in skulls, but a deeper one stored in symbols encoded in architecture reawakened whenever a human hand lays stone upon stone. The question that remains the one that scholars can't quite phrase without trembling is simple: who started the thread? Was the first dynasty the result of random convergence, or did it inherit from an even older order, one erased too cleanly to trace? Every ruin we've studied whispers the same suggestion: someone taught humanity how to build not just cities, but continuity. And that lesson has never been forgotten. You start to realize that civilization itself behaves like a single organism, shedding, healing, mutating, but never dying. The empires are merely cells, brief configurations of the same living tissue. When one fails, another grows. When one forgets, another remembers. The continuity isn't political or national, it's cognitive. Civilization is a collective mind that dreams through us. Perhaps that's what the ancients meant by immortality. Not the endless reign of kings or gods, but the survival of the story, the thread that keeps weaving, no matter how often the loom burns. Every law, every myth, every rediscovered ruin is another stitch in that tapestry, pulling the past through the needle's eye of the present. And as you follow that thread forward, it points toward a single, humbling realization: humanity has never once truly begun again. We've only ever continued. The dust settles slowly now. You've walked through the ruins of empires, touched the cracked stones of vanished dynasties, and listened to the echo of voices that never really left. Civilization, that fragile, defiant idea, keeps breathing through the centuries, no matter how often it dies. And as you stand at the edge of time, watching another sun set over another forgotten city, you can almost hear it, the heartbeat of everything we've built, still pulsing beneath the silence. It's tempting to think of history as a graveyard, a place where greatness ends, where dust wins. But maybe it's more like soil. Every fallen city feeds the next. Every broken monument becomes a quarry for new dreams. The clay tablets of Sumer turn to Roman marble, then to silicon screens. The same message keeps rewriting itself, that meaning once born refuses to stay buried. We've spent these hours chasing the origins of power, of order, of civilization itself, and yet the answer may be far simpler than we imagined. Humanity doesn't rise once. It rises constantly. From floodplains and firestorms, from the bones of lost empires, from the ashes of its own arrogance. We build, we collapse, and then inevitably we build again. Each dynasty, each empire, each fragile attempt to make order from dust is part of the same heartbeat. And so the question changes. It's no longer how did we begin, but why do we keep beginning? Perhaps that's the secret written in the ruins, that civilization isn't a destination, but a rhythm. A pulse that never stops, only shifts shape. It's in the bricks of Ur and the circuits of Tokyo in Hammurabi's code, and every law you still obey in the myths that teach us what we are, and the memories that remind us what we've already been. Look closely, and you'll see it: dust in the cracks of your shoes, the same dust that once clung to the feet of kings. It carries their failures and their triumphs, their prayers and their blueprints. You walk on history, but you also walk with it. The dust remembers the dynasty, and the dynasty even in ruin dreams of rebirth. So when the next empire falls, as they always do, don't mourn the end. Watch the dust. Listen for the hum beneath it. because somewhere even now the foundations of the next civilization are already stirring. The story doesn't stop here. It only waits patient as stone ancient as thought for us to build again. And maybe one day, someone will stand over our ruins and whisper the same words they rose from dust and built eternity.